How many people are coming in? Hello. I just want you to know the room is live, so don't say anything you don't want everybody to hear. So we are beginning, even though everybody is so excited to see each other in 3 dimensions. I'm seeing all sorts of people I haven't seen in forever, and I want to welcome everyone here in the room and people virtually who are joining. My name is Barbara Bierer. I'm the faculty director of the Regulatory Foundations Ethics and Law program of the Harvard Catalyst, the CTSA. This started as sort of an internal CTSA effort that we were going to try and sort of get everyone together because we were all struggling with reviewing AI in its many dimensions in human participant research. It turns out there is interest in this. And by the time we had planned it, AI had changed again. So it's wonderful to be here, and I welcome the virtual participants. If you can't hear us or anything is technically wrong, please put it in the chat, and Evan will be monitoring the chat. There will be questions and answers that you can, or at least questions you can put in, and we'll make sure that we try to field them from the floor here. We will repeat the questions from the floor as they come up. This is a very intense and pressured day. We have no time to be friendly. We have no time to make jokes. We have to do content from morning till we start drinking at 5. And a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, well, I just did that. First of all, there will be some light refreshments in the back. There will also be like catering if you have special dietary needs. I'm afraid it's too late. If you want to follow the questions in chat, feel free to join the Zoom, but you don't need to because we will, as I said, repeat everything that is said. But please do use the microphones, and we'll have folks running them around at the time appropriate. There will be a survey after the event, and in order to get CIP credits, you'll need to fill out that survey. And then we're going to record the sessions, and they'll be available, as will the slides, with permission. And we have yet to seek permission from everyone, so we hope that that will be true, but the slides will likely be available afterwards. Just to point through the day, so you know it's, or the afternoon, what's happening. First, we're going to have 2 keynotes, which I'll introduce in a second, and then questions and answers for those 2 keynotes. Then we're going to have our only virtual speaker, who is actually in DC giving anchoring another conference, but felt that this was so important that he wanted to come back and give this perspective. That's Ken Mandl from Children's Hospital. We're then going to do a case. There will be a presentation of that case, and then multiple people discussing it, and then which is by Cheryl Brigham, and really a terrific researcher as well. And then Benji Silverman will be talking about specifically the IRB review, and Megan Singleton, how can AI assist the IRB? Turns out that you have to hold this like you're eating the microphone in order to be heard. And then we'll have one more case discussion on the same format, where there will be a panel, and we'll present the case and then have everyone talk about it. And then my friend and colleague Aaron Kirby will be closing this up. I have to say that this would not have been possible without, first of all, support from NCATS for the Catalyst, and second of all, the undying efforts of Evan Sohn and the rest of the Catalyst team, who has been on it from the time that he actually thought that this would be a good topic. So without further ado, the bathrooms down the hall, and we'll figure that out for anybody who needs it. feel free to get up. So keep questions in the Q&A chat for additional information and comments specifically to the virtual attendees. And as I say, I'm going to try and answer, at least start with some question, and then hopefully alternate, or at least make sure we get those, and then we will be sending you the post-event via email. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Andrew Hantel from Children's Hospital, from Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Harvard Medical School, who will be giving the first keynote, and be the acting director of the Office of Human Research Protections, Julie Kaneshiro. So let me invite Andrew up.
All right, thanks for the nice introduction. Oh, I was told that somebody was going to put a mic on me. I just threw it in my pocket. Yep. Can you all hear me? Yes.
And then you can use that advanced slides.
Okay, wonderful. All right.
Keep the microphone.
Perfect. All right. So we can jump right into it. Here are my disclosures, funding, and most importantly, acknowledgements to my colleagues who work with me in some AI and human participant research. And so to start us off today, I think it's important just to make sure we all have the same definitions of things. First, which is for artificial intelligence. And these are both pulled from a Nature Review article from last year. And so for artificial intelligence, the definition that we're going to be using is the ability of a machine to learn and recognize patterns and interactions from representative data, and to use this information for improving the process of decision-making, whereas machine learning is the process of fitting predictive models to data or of identifying information groupings within data. The field of machine learning essentially attempts to approximate or imitate humans' ability to recognize patterns, albeit in an objective manner, using computation. And so I usually think about artificial intelligence as the more general term, and so that's the one that I'll be using most often. So to start with, how is AI being used in biomedical research today? Here are a number of areas in which it is already being applied. Oh, I realize this is not going forward. There we go. In which it's already being applied and deployed. These include drug development, so things like molecule discovery, interaction simulations, medical data analyses like EHR and tissue banks, triage and diagnostics, such as pathology and radiology, prognostic tools in terms of individualized risk assessment, decision support, so things like treatment and care delivery processes, physical support tools, so actual surgical and procedural augmentation, health monitoring wearables, so more like direct to patient devices and algorithms, and then clinical trial design in terms of different ways to enhance dose escalation and optimization, and then finally kind of post-development implementation as well as dissemination. And how far have things already progressed? This is a table of FDA-approved devices split by the different FDA panel that was the lead review for them. And as you can see, as of earlier this month, we were already over 500. So there are things that have both been through the kind of local IRB processes and the FDA regulatory structures. And this is growing every day. And while things here you can see are mainly with visual diagnostics, other areas are quickly following, and this number is going to be kind of going up exponentially. And so what's been the background? Before getting kind of to the individual research ethics issues, I kind of wanted to talk about the background of generalizability of the evidence for some of the things that are already out there. And you can see that for this study, which looked at 130 different FDA-approved devices, and this was back in 2020. So I think it speaks to a little bit of the evolution of the approval process that has gone on. And, but you can see kind of differences in terms of where the AI device was approved in those categories on the left, and then the different squares and circles and the different things kind of represent different parts or different categories of evidence and study design that were used. And you can see here that gray devices were basically approved on single center studies. Square devices are high risk devices, meaning that there's potential for harm or performance alteration if it's used outside the approved setting. And then the red outlines, which you may not be able to see, but hopefully this might work, but are basically these couple here, and I don't know why it says 4 on the right. This wasn't a study that I did, but 4 doesn't seem to equal 2. And in that case, where?
Next to the squares.
Oh, man. Okay, I'm a little bit colorblind, so that's probably why. Well, I still can't see them. Anyway, so at least from that standpoint, you can see that whether it's 4 or 2, it is not the majority. And so we can say that, in the past, kind of the evidence that's been brought to bear and kind of the approval means that at least 32 of these studies, this is not clicking now, 32 of these studies, there we go, were based on, were high-risk studies that were single center and retrospective. And that was the other thing that I forgot to mention in that retrospective portion. And so together, that's kind of a large number of studies based on that, or a large number of devices approved on things that were maybe not what we think about as kind of high levels of evidence. And I would, again, point you back that this is 2020 and more speaks to the evolution of how everybody's been trying to play catch up from the regulatory side of things and kind of provide us with better background for safety and efficacy for some of these things. And so getting into the main brunt of the talk, what are the main ethical issues that AI raises for human participant research? Some of these are general ethical issues. Some of these are domains that are kind of very specific for AI. And so I think some of this is out of order, so we'll kind of go like this first. And just to say that for transparency and explicability, or kind of the black box phenomenon of whether or not you can really understand, or the extent to which you can explain what the decision-making process is in an artificial intelligence tool. We have the idea of informed consent, which I don't need to totally explain for this audience, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Participant safety, also fairly self-explanatory. Fairness and bias, both in terms of the development and then kind of post-approval as well. Privacy and security, both related to intended and unintended uses. Responsibility and accountability, and how that might be more diffuse if it's the AI making the decision and not necessarily the clinician or the researcher. And then the kind of less hard and fast thing when it comes to the regulatory sphere, but still important from our ethics standpoint, is kind of what it means for patient autonomy and physician dignity and our ability to provide empathy. And so back to this black box phenomena. We have the idea of transparency and explicability in that AI uses complex algorithms to digest and synthesize information and report answers. And so there's only so much that we can really know about the decision-making process. And a couple questions come from this, essentially, that are related to the idea of like human intuition. So how much do we actually know about every decision that we're making? And how much, let's say, for your choice of whatever college you went to, whatever undergrad, like how much of that was based on a pure like flow diagram of every decision that went into that final choice, and how much did you understand it? How much would anybody understand these things? And whether or not we actually need to hold AI to a higher standard because it's something that's non-human or not. And with AI and kind of the ever-growing complexity of these models, is there an inherent trade-off between explicability and complexity? In that, as things become more complex, they're inherently going to get to the point that we will never fully be able to understand them. And is that something that we are okay with? Is there kind of a degree to which we can kind of pass off the responsibility of understanding kind of how your Excel gets to the like final column or final cell of 800 things that you added up? You believe that it got to there in the end. You don't have to know each of the individual calculations. And when it gets very complex, are you still okay with what's called this computational reliabilism? And then we also have to think about the different actors that are involved in interacting with AI. Is this something where we need to make sure that an AI is explainable to patients, explainable by patients? Same thing with physicians and researchers. Who needs to know both from the standpoint of safety and from the standpoint of informed consent? And then finally, how does this impact the idea of expectations for future transparency or explicability, in that we may not we may not really be able to understand at any one point where an AI is in terms of its evolution. It's a generative thing. It grows and evolves just like we do. And so when we're having somebody, let's say, consent for something where we're talking about a drug, we can say, okay, these are how the past participants have fared, the risks and benefits for those participants, and I can say that the drug, the molecule is the same thing that we're using in them as we're going to use in you. But for AI, those risks and benefits happened, but then the AI is different than when it happened to those participants. So how do we actually consent people? Can we ever really consent people for that? And get to informed consent. We think about these threshold elements, voluntariness and competence, information elements of disclosure, recommendation, and understanding, and then consent elements of decision and authorization from the ethics standpoint. And AI doesn't really change the nature of those things within informed consent, but it kind of provides three separate applications in which it should be performed, and it makes one aspect of that outline a little bit of a sticky wicket. And those are consent for the use of, those applications at least, are consent for the use of data in AI and machine learning tools. And so are you consenting somebody for their data to be used in a tool that is being studied unto itself? Is it consent for participating in a study that actually assesses the safety or efficacy of an AI or ML device? And then third is what's been called by Glenn Cohen over at the law school penumbral consent, kind of the penumbra around like a star or something. And so that idea is that the patient isn't actually going to sign up for either of these things. Like it's not like, oh, you're giving your data to an AI tool that's going to be trained, or oh, this is a study about AI, but oh, you're entering a study. By the way, along the way, there might be like an AI-proof device or something else that's in there. And do you need to have that reported specifically in the consent? Do people need to know about that? And getting into safety, we can kind of split things into processes and categories of safety. What I mean by that is in terms of process, you can have differences in kind of the recognition of AI and machine learning safety issues. So if there's not that adequate explicability, if there's a black box, we may not know when things are going wrong. We may not be able to recognize them. We may need to have kind of new mechanisms for reporting and managing them based on the actual issue that arises, which we'll get to in a second. And then the idea of the categories of safety, which I lump into kind of intrinsic and extrinsic. And that really means intrinsic things to the AI. So how are the kind of inputs getting into the AI? What's the decision making that's happening within there? And then the outputs. And then there's the extrinsic, which really means those things coming from user interactions with the AI. We have issues related to when things are being developed as well, and then after they evolve after approval. And this was a study looking at some of those safety events that was just published a couple months ago. And the blue is the extrinsic, the orange is the intrinsic. And so you can see, at least for these safety reports that were filed with the FDA, that the majority of them were actually intrinsic to the AI, albeit with like the inputs that were getting into the device and what it used to make the decision, rather than on the right, like kind of decision making itself and the algorithmic error. Though by category, algorithmic error was still the number 2 cause for safety events. There we go. And then fairness and bias. You kind of have a large camps of these, and under them we'll kind of have a whole tree of a lot of different biases that we can talk through. The general categories are, as you can see, development biases, so things that are going on as an AI is being developed and studied. You have emergent biases, so you have an approved AI, but it's still going to be changing over time depending on the context within which it's used, and kind of all the information that's still flowing into it. And then related to that, we have that idea of transparency and explicability. Under these, a lot of different ones. So historical bias and sample bias are a little bit overlapping. It's basically the idea that samples don't accurately represent the populations for which the AI is being developed and be kind of approved in. Labeling bias is about training the AI to identify things based on biased labeling. Aggregation bias is categorizations of continuous or kind of lumping groups together inappropriately. Whereas things on the right, including user bias, is more around kind of how people are interacting with the device and the decisions they're making based off of that. Basically, you have access bias, who's actually getting access to this amongst the healthcare community.
Excuse me. And then even under these, you can have some of these latent bias. Oops, I realized I have two slides just to make sure I can see my notes. So I'm clicking forward on two things at once, and it's not always working well. It's like the padding and rubbing here. Anyway, so and under the user-based ones, you can have specific things about implicit bias of the person, kind of whether or not they trust AI in general at baseline, and whether or not they're kind of making confirmation bias about things that you assume will be true and that you're expecting the AI to tell you. And then latent bias is just a more specific version related to the kind of idea of emergent biases over time based on where an AI is used. And then we have privacy and security. So related to this, there's kind of intended and unintended consequences. And intended is what I think most people are thinking about. So kind of how is the AI kind of scraping the EHR and kind of whose data it's getting access to, how it's interacting with cloud computing that may be outside kind of the data ecosystem within which kind of HIPAA protections exist, and needing to get contracts and agreements with third parties to make sure that those data are being kind of exported and forwarded appropriately and not actually going somewhere that doesn't kind of uphold those laws and statutes that we abide by. And then separate from this is the kind of general idea that AI or kind of AI, quantum computing, all these things that are coming down the pipeline have the ability to really re-identify unidentified subjects, which is its whole talk into itself, but I think we'll just kind of leave it at that for the moment. And then separately from this is the idea that AI can also be used kind of maliciously to really provide unintended data access and use more from the standpoint of kind of like malware, anything else, kind of attacking the regulatory the regulated data that we have and that we use every day. From the standpoint of responsibility and accountability, we always ask who's really responsible for the AI. It's kind of easy to say, yes, this falls to the same parties as it would in other research. But the fact that the AI is changing over time during and then after the course of research makes it more difficult to really pin everything onto like the PI for them to know if and when things have changed substantially, when things might not be explicable in the first place, and then when is it enough that there are actually differences in the risks and benefits, when should those be reported, kind of like I talked about before related to informed consent. And so there are kind of a lot of these different parties, clinician, patient, institution, supervisor, regulatory body that have been in place, for pretty much all research. And now we kind of have these newer parties of AI researcher and developer, which are in some ways analogous to kind of other third parties that are worked with in terms of other drugs and devices. And then we kind of have this idea of consequences of diffuse responsibility. If one person isn't taking the lead, they're kind of diffusing responsibility and who is really in charge. And then you also have this related idea of the decreasing information gap. This isn't really related too specifically to, let's say, the research setting, but it's more the idea that it used to be kind of physician over here as the trained, guided counselor for a patient who has a lot of information, and the patient's over here not having much information and kind of relying on us because we have this information gap. Now, with AI, you might know a lot more than the physician. So you kind of have the physician being pushed more towards the patient. And so how is that really changing the relationship between the physician and patient and their reliance on us, not necessarily in a good or bad way, but just kind of how that fiduciary relationship works and how they really trust us to be doing things for them when the AI is maybe the one making the decision. And we're both kind of looking at it like, what the hell does this mean? So is this idea of autonomy, dignity, and empathy. And these are just some different direct patient uses of AI, where you can kind of see kind of the bar moving to the right as the algorithm becomes more autonomous and kind of talks to the patient more. And so I feel like it's telling you, like, sorry, you're paying for cancer. It may not have the same empathy and the same kind of intake from the patient to be able to like say that somebody is being empathetic for it if it's just like a little chat in there versus you talking to your physician, talking to your nurse, like working with them to come up with a plan. And I don't know if that can ever be replaced. So in very broad strokes, kind of how do we manage these problems and potential issues for human participant research? Some of it is within the scope of traditional regulatory bodies, such as IRBs, and generally to get from AI where we kind of have the AI that we have and are creating now. We need both kind of ethical norms assessments, which is a lot of the norms that I was just talking about on those last 7 or 8 slides. And then we also need a developmental process, which is shown here, which kind of through which changes to manage decisions relating to these norms. And usually in ethics, we kind of have these two, let's say, general camps of kind of looking at the actual principles and the norms of the ethics themselves. And then we have like, how do we actually implement this? How do we use it to create an ethical process? Because in the end, all of the things that I was talking about, there's no right answer for any one of those. And it all changes today based on the particular AI, the particular setting within which it's used, et cetera. And so we usually end up going with these processes as kind of the structure within which we make sure things are ethical. Even we know that in the end, not everybody might agree. These things might be different situation by situation. And so for us, we kind of developed a process development framework that we're discussing now how to implement it at our institute. And this is based on the accountability for reasonableness framework, which is kind of a general ethics process framework developed by Daniels and Sabin. And so what it is basically making sure that you're meeting these kind of 5 tenets in the process that you're setting up. This includes being relevant, so both kind of clarifying the goals and the scope of the process, the different ethical domains, everything I just talked through, kind of the rationale for any decision that's being made within those domains, and kind of what's happening in terms of publicity, how are we communicating about this process and about the decisions that are being made to the relevant stakeholders. And then revision. We need to not only come up with plans, but also come up with changes based on new evidence, changes based on responses from stakeholders, and define really explicit assessments for these things. Fourth, basically need to make sure that stakeholders are included in these processes, and that people aren't marginalized as they have been historically in medicine. Provide communication and training for those people. And then enforcement. So the things that are kind of come up with through this process are things that need to be enforceable, because if not, what's the point? And so that's the end of my talk. And so I asked GPT a couple of jokes about IRBs. And if you feel like you want to read them, the cyclists. If you want to read them, there you go. So thanks, everybody.
Where would you suggest?
Yeah.
Wherever you
I'm just also move this away.
Okay. So
You just do it.
the clicker is
Yeah, that's the clicker.
just to advance is this one
Advance, yeah.
to the right.
Correct. Let me just quickly check something. Speech level.
Right. Oh, hi. All right, excellent. So to be invited to talk about this topic. I was asked to speak about this from a federal perspective. Now, a few things. Oh, okay. Is this better? It's okay now, all right? You certainly don't want to hear me that many times. So a few caveats about being able to speak from the federal perspective. First of all, I'm from the Office for Human Research Protections. As Barbara noted, we're a small office within the Department of Health and Human Services, which is only one small component of the federal system. But in addition to that, I have to throw up the standard HHS disclaimer that whatever I say might not be representative of the policy, even within the department in which I work. But I will share my thoughts with you about that. The personal disclaimer is that, the more that I've tried to learn about this area, the more I realize I do not know this area. And there's a quote that I read in one of the articles that resonated with me on a personal level. And it was said by a robotist at Columbia University. And he said that, at some point, explaining AI to a human will be like explaining Shakespeare to a dog, right? And I feel like this dog, a lot of times in these conversations, confused and a little bit befuddled. But with that, let me try to provide a little bit of clarity, at least, in terms of how I think our rules are being thought of in this space and how they might apply. And so I've organized my remarks with you into 4 buckets of topics. First, to just provide a very general ethical challenges and opportunities as they're being discussed in the community, how it's being used in participant research, how environments might apply, and then some thoughts about how we might move forward, and specifically noting the limits of the common to address fully the ethical and regulatory concerns that might be arising in this area, the need for shared responsibility, and then to leave you with some resources. So first, as this field is advancing and the values that we are to uphold. And I think those are trust, transparency, the furthering of justice. And I really do see this as offering us both challenges but opportunities. I think the fact that raising questions about them and doing that in a very public way and engaging in those discussions in meetings like this and elsewhere, I think which we can move forward ethically here. I think that really increases our chances of doing that. And the fact that I think the public maybe more than in the past is aware of these technologies as they're being used in everyday life, and then also how they're being translated and developed in the research arena, I think is a really positive thing. So you see them as sort of double-edged in a positive sense. There is absolutely speed. That's a challenge, right? Just keeping up. Like no out is difficult. It's everywhere all the time. And just getting a sense of the risks and vulnerabilities associated with that. Representative, certainly concerns about bias, concerns about social inequality, but right? I mean, it's not like these concerns exist previously. They always have been embedded within our systems, but there's something about this conversation and the pervasiveness of these activities and the data collection that I think is making us as a society to these issues, which I think is a real opportunity for change and also hopefully for improvements in this area. Do you want me to stop?
Sorry, I'm just checking.
Okay.
Is it okay if you handheld or?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's fine.
So
I'm getting the sense that people are hearing me.
no, it's not you. It's we're just having some issues.
Okay.
So we'll just turn that off. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
There we go. Just use this one.
Okay.
Closer. Yeah.
Is this better? Okay. Right. Another aspect, I think a challenge here is the meaning of public and private These are not, I think, mutually exclusive terms, really, as people are thinking about them. And our regulations, the common rule, doesn't, at least we have not sort of clarified this space. There are also variations in people's perspectives. We as individuals have different ideas about privacy and confidentiality. I think that's especially true. I see it with my own children in the younger generations. But it's true really across the board. There's also uncertainty about and variability in people's acceptance of AI, and that's probably going to differ also depending on the nature of the AI itself. The black box problem that Dr. Hantel also already referenced. Long-term implications, effect on groups beyond individuals. These are two aspects of AI that are, explicitly not addressed under the common rule, but nevertheless are critically important to this field. Consent raises many issues, as you've already heard. It also questions about when it might be appropriate to waive informed consent for research in this area. And I put risk and benefit assessment last. In some ways, it's actually, critical to all of this. I think all of these issues relate to how we think about risk and benefit, and just this sort of uncertainty about how we're thinking about these issues and how people generally, we are all thinking about these issues, make it very difficult to carry out a risk assessment when there's so much unknown about AI and also about what people think of it. So, as I sat there as that confused dog, I tried to distill how I was thinking AI is being used in human subjects research in a way that sort of maybe is more relatable, at least to me, for thinking about the intersection between AI and research and the common rule. And it led me to think that maybe there are three sort of buckets of research where AI is being used. The first category identified here is big data research, secondary research to develop AI or machine learning. We hear a lot about big data research, and it took me a while to sort of get my head around what are we talking about here when we say big data research. And I think what we're talking about here is usually secondary research, right? That's intended to develop AI and machine learning. Well, I'll talk more about that. Also, AI is being used as a research intervention, right? And then in other cases, it's being used as a research procedure or a research tool. And I think this tracks actually really nicely to Dr. Hantel's categories as you talked about them in consent. And we actually didn't coordinate this, so I was actually reassured that maybe I'm thinking about this correctly, but I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from you when we get to the discussion about whether this is too simplistic a way to think about these categories of where research and AI are intersecting currently. So before going into those categories a little bit more, let me just talk about the implications for the common rule here, and just to say a little bit about when the common rule applies or does not apply. And really, you'll see, as I go through this, my point in raising this in large part is to just point out the limitations of the common rule to really adequately address all of the concerns that are being raised. And I say that both because of scope, right, but also in terms of what the common rule protections actually offer, even when a research study is covered. So just a little bit of the backdrop here, just to remind folks about the common rule. It's adopted by 20 departments and agencies, and its scope is really limited to research that is either conducted or supported by the federal departments and agencies that have adopted the rule. So each of the department agencies are responsible for their own oversight and compliance. It doesn't necessarily mean that the research has no ethical concerns or it presents no risk to participants, which I've already alluded to. And regardless of regulatory compliance, fundamental to us doing research with people is the importance of being mindful of the ethical responsibilities to research participants when carrying out these studies. So the jurisdiction of the human subject protection regulations, just to delve into this a little bit in more detail, it's research that's conducted or supported by HHS, and conductor support can boil down to really three primary things. Money, financial support being the provision of identifiable private information, right? So like CMS beneficiary data, for example, might be a trigger for HHS support. And then also the provision of tangible goods or services by a federal department. So maybe the paying for the drug that might be evaluated as part of a study could trigger support. And then also we have, as some of you know, the still voluntary extension of the regulations, the assurance of compliance. So that's another way in which institutions can currently extend the regulations beyond HHS supported or conducted research. But even once we've determined that the study is HHS supported or conducted, the institution has checked the box and applying the rules to research carried out there, the rules identify some additional provisions or definitions that have to be satisfied before the regulations are actually in play. And critical to that is, is the activity meeting the regulatory definition of research? Only if then, is the research involving human subjects? Even if the study does involve human subjects, it could meet an exemption, which would take it outside of the scope of the regulations. And only if it's not exempt is the study covered. So there are many ways in which the regulations actually further distill what studies are actually covered by the regulations. On the left side of the slide here, you see, the regulations do apply. So when you have non-exempt human subjects research, the substantive protections are IRB review and informed consent, unless informed consent can be waived. And when the regulations don't apply, the bottom line is basically that investigators, institutions have a lot of flexibility to how they oversee or how they should be overseeing this research, irrespective of whether or not there's a regulatory requirement to do so. The ethical responsibilities certainly don't disappear. So just a reminder of the definition of research. It's a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, evaluation, designed to develop and contribute to generalizable knowledge, right? And I'll be coming back to why I'm highlighting these definitions. Also, the definition of a human subject can be some ambiguity with AI research about this at times. Important here, it's a living individual, human investigator who's obtaining information, intervention, interaction with a person. Another point to this definition is obtaining identifiable private information or identifiable biospecimens. So identifiability and privacy are key to this second prong. And I'll be saying a little bit more about that in the context of these categories, three categories of research that I identified earlier. And so the first one being this big data research and secondary research to develop or test AI or machine learning. Secondary research, I'm using that term to refer to the use of information that has been collected for a purpose other than for this study that is proposed to be carried out by an investigator. So this could be information that exists, from this non-research context, or just, as well as information that has been created from a previous research study, right? But the point being that it is not being generated in action with an individual or intervention for purposes of
this study. So a few key questions about this kind of research that I think that occurred to me is important to be asking. What data is going to be used as part of this research study? Is the data representative given the purpose of the study and the research question? Second is research even. This is sometimes a question. Is it QA? Is it both? Is it product testing? I'll be saying a little bit more about that in a moment. Also, are human subjects? Is it private information? Is it identifiable or coded information? I'll be saying more about that too. Could the study qualify for exemption? If it is research that involves human subjects, and there are a few exemptions that are especially applicable to the area of secondary research. And then finally, should consent be waived? So let me talk next a little bit about the question of whether it's research or not. And there are sometimes claims about research or activities, I should say, in this area not being research. There are other labels that are put on it and used frequently. It's QI/QA, it's user experience, interface, it's human computer interaction, it's product testing, it's product development, it's just training. And I guess the thing I want to emphasize here in answer to this question, whether these activities can also be research activities, that the answer can be yes, that the label of the activities really is not what's important. What's important is whether the activities actually meet the definition of research.
Sorry, I'm just going to trying to mute this.
Sorry about the audio problems. Should I continue or not? Yeah, okay. All right. The other final point here is to just note that these terms, any of these terms and the definition of research are not mutually exclusive. That it's quite possible that the label is appropriate, that it's, a QI/QA activity, for example, but also happens to meet the regulatory definition of research. We have some FAQs at OHRP on QI, so I just point this one out here that we say that if the purpose is limited to the following only, that this could be a QI activity that does not also involve research. So implementing a practice to improve the quality of patient care and collecting data on the practice for clinical, practical, or administrative purposes. We give as an example of something that could be purely QI and not a research activity. Right? So if you're not implementing it for the purpose of assessing it or evaluating it, but rather implementing it for administrative or clinical practice only, that activity can fall outside of the definition of research. But where the purpose is to establish scientific evidence, that would be a signal that the definition of research threshold has been met. So another question that arises in this area of secondary research is whether human subjects are involved. And there are two aspects of our definition of human subject that I think are important here. And this is taken directly from the regulations. What's highlighted here under private information is the aspect of what's private that I think really is evolving. And one that at least I don't have a firm understanding of what ought to fall inside or outside of this scope. And that is where the individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place. Well, our expectations, I think, here are changing, right? Where more and more information about us that maybe previously we would have reasonably had the expectation was not being observed or recorded
is maybe becoming less of a reasonable expectation as this is becoming really rather prolific. And then the second piece of this definition of a human subject is about identifiable private information. And the definition speaks to this being related to information that may readily be ascertained by the investigator or associated with the information, right? And so there are questions often raised about this. What does it mean to be readily ascertained by the investigator or associated with the information or the biospecimen? What our office has said in response to questions like this is that you simply being a unique identifier, right? So being unique to a person, like a fingerprint or like genomic information, not sufficient to make it individually identifiable, that we think there needs to be sort of an association to be able to link that unique information about the individual to a particular individual. Right? So there would need to be sort of that linking information in our view to make the information readily identifiable under this threshold of what's identifiable under the regulations. Oop. Another clarification about a question that's sometimes raised is, what I think is about the second part of that definition that I had up before, which is associated with the information, that the identity of the person is associated with the information. And we have said in our office that facial images in and of themselves or voice is something that is on its face, pardon the pun, identifiable to a person, right? Even in the absence of any other associated information. And, both of these types of information and data are being used in AI. All right, so research as a intervention. So this is the second category of research that I identified here. And here are some of the questions that I thought would be important to explore. Are human subjects involved? And sort of related to that, who's the investigator? I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about that in a moment. Will the AI intervention have human oversight? What's known or unknown, maybe more importantly, about the research intervention? What should the consent say about risks and benefits? Can informed consent be waived? What's known about how people feel about the use of the research intervention, and maybe especially in mental health research, where a lot of this kind of research is occurring. And there is variation, it seems, in how people will feel about it. Some people might prefer it or seem to prefer interacting with AI, and others not so much. Will some research sites be privately funded or not engaged? So this gets to jurisdiction again, and sort of what do you do when you might have a study, but part of it might be covered by the common rule at certain sites and not at others, and sort of ethically speaking, what ought to be occurring even in those sites that might not be directly funded. So a bit about the focus on investigator and who is an investigator, to explore that. A moment, I put up the definition of a human subject here just to remind us of the relevance of this question, which references an investigator, right? But can artificial intelligence be an investigator conducting human subjects research? In some of the studies, there might not be any interaction or interfacing with the actual person who's deploying the artificial intelligence as a research intervention. And is that human subjects research? And so I think the answer to that question is yes. But who is an investigator? And so this is taken from, some of our guidance about what constitutes an investigator. Obtaining consent, interacting with subjects, communicating with the IRB. We have a very
interpretation of investigator in our office, that it includes anybody who is involved in conducting human subjects research. And while the person might not be intervening, interacting directly with the person in AI research, there is still a person behind the scenes, at least, who is deploying that intervention. And so I do think that we do have an investigator, a human investigator, involved in these studies. And then finally, just to end, AI is a research procedure or tool. This is a third category where it's not, AI is not a research procedure that's being evaluated as an intervention in the study, but instead just being used as part of the research, being used to analyze study information like X-rays, MRIs, or other images, used to interact or intervene with human subjects, maybe to elicit information from them, or used to seek consent even. And there are also applications that are in use to assist with protocol development. A few key questions to think about in this arena. What's known about the AI procedure or tool? Is it approved by FDA? Should the consent document disclose that the AI procedure or tool is being used and what's known about it? And is there human oversight or involvement in the use of that tool or procedure? So just moving forward to close, just pointing out that the common rule is not going to apply to the majority of AI research, and ensuring that the AI research proceeds ethically is really a shared responsibility among so many federal sponsors and regulators, creators, users, researchers, IRBs, the public, really just to name a few. And it's sort of, this has left me with just some questions about IRBs in particular. How do we ensure that IRBs have the appropriate expertise to be reviewing these studies, and whether there's any value in creating AI-specific IRBs? I have for you on the slides, which I am happy to have shared. So you have these, just some resources that we've developed. I seem to have clicked the wrong button. So I can't proceed. But anyway, you'll see these resources, and I think I'm at time anyway. So really looking forward to discussion with all of you. Thanks so much.
Perfect. So we have time. Whoa. We have time. All right, we don't have time for questions. Thank you. Okay, we have time for questions. Any online before we? So let me start then. I'm always good for a question or two. So you talked about bias, and here are all Andrew talked about bias, and here are all the different ways that data can be biased. How do we evaluate that? That's the first. I have a few.
I think even outside the context of AI, even outside the context of AI, I think we're struggling with that idea of bias and representativeness generally in research. So there's the diversity action plans that I know were just part of the recent Fedora legislation that went through, trying to help or at least enforce representativeness in studies that are going to be going for approval. And I think in kind of a simple way of saying it, it really requires us to first define kind of what the population is in which the study tool, whatever you're talking about, is going to be used, and trying to describe that population in terms of, at least in a basic sense, demographics, and trying to understand kind of who are the people who are going to be subject to this tool, to this drug, to whatever you're talking about, and trying to make sure that the data in this case, or the trial in other cases, really represents that group, as well as we can define what the different dimensions of diversity are in there. And so I think there's that aspect of it. From the AI standpoint, I think there's also the idea of, as I said, kind of the developmental biases and then kind of the latent biases. So it's not only where is the initial kind of training or validation data sets coming from and how representative are those, and kind of what the different variables are that are being used in those, and kind of how there are different aspects of those variables that can be maximized or kind of not. And then there's also the idea of after something is developed, when you're applying it to different populations, the data that's being fed in there, if the algorithm isn't locked, is still kind of continuing to develop over time and kind of incorporate those into its training. And so I think it's both understanding bias from the standpoint of where the initial data, somebody's coming on, hello, where the initial biases can come from in the data sets that are being used to develop things, and then also kind of the biases coming in the end. And again, I know I'm speaking particularly to biases in terms of demographics, but there are many other layers of that, as I mentioned on the screen. Is that helpful?
Hi, I'm Ken Keel. I'm from Dana-Farber. So Dr. Hantel, I know you suggested I not raise this question. So I think AI could at least be construed as sort of a spectrum of technologies, right? Ranging from, a DVT risk score you can calculate manually to the EKG machines that have been giving us automated reads for 40 years to, the GPT-4 with trillions of parameters model, right? So how do we decide at what point the technology merits our sort of special considerations that we're talking about? If the model can explain itself, does it still need the special considerations, for example?
Thanks, Ken. Ken's also like an actual AI researcher, so he comes to this with a lot more information than I do. But you'll be hearing from him shortly anyway in the panel discussion. So I agree. I think there, kind of like I mentioned, there's that idea of aggregation bias, and that there's a continuous variable, continuous spectrum of things in terms of how complex they get. And at some point, you have to lump things into categories to really say what exactly fits and not. And I think a lot of what you were just discussing in terms of things that might fall into research or fall into QI kind of has that same thing in that there might be studies that are kind of on the edge, or maybe have different aspects of it that might kind of meet the level of complexity or not. It's not I honestly, I don't think there's a one great definition cutoff answer for that. I think it might, again, I'm not entirely sure, but I think, coming from the standpoint of like methods being used to kind of come up with the algorithm, if it's a very simple, I don't know, like decision algorithm that kind of has, very laid out points that you can kind of follow explicitly, versus something where in the end you are not able to kind of explicitly see every step of the decision tree. I think that might be a point, but again, that's just kind of speculation at this point. It hasn't really definitions.
Thank you, Julie. Anybody can feel free to raise their hand or just interrupt as Ken did. Julie, you said one of the open questions is, what should participants know? Should they know about a tool in the middle of, or in the process, in the research procedures, or as part of what's not speaking for the federal government, not even for OHRP? What's your feeling about that?
Yeah, I think I would err on the side of disclosure. I think there's, it's of course going to depend on the typical, the study that we're talking about. But I do think that this area is so new, and that we don't know exactly, what people want to know. And so I think that it would be prudent and probably most respectful to disclose it. If it's information that the person ends up thinking is superfluous to their decision, then they would quickly skip over it. But if it's something that they would have concerns about,
then I think that would prompt them to ask. Now, I think that maybe the more difficult question is, what if you're designing a study where it's a research intervention is the AI, and, the disclosure might somehow thwart your research question. I think that raises different issues where, the consent disclosing, right, that this is AI could raise questions where it's really sort of a sort of a deception study in a sense.
Yeah, but we have a process for that, which is we disclose afterwards. So I don't know that that is different about AI. So I have to think about that one. Let me ask one more, or do you want to ask a burning question? Oh, one online. All right, go for it.
So this is two questions for OHRP. Both are around head MRI from your slides, and I hope people can hear me. Does OHRP have perspective on the re-identifiability of full head MRI or other internal images? She mentioned facial images, but assumed that meant photos versus scans. And the second question is, what is OHRP's stance on whether a structural MRI of a person's brain, which would include structural information about the person's head, is sufficiently anonymized? We have been asked whether this data can be considered de-identified.
Do you want them to submit that question so you can answer it officially? You can say so.
Yeah, that might be preferable. I mean, I think I understand the question. It's complicated. I'm not sure there's an easy answer there. But I don't think that we've opined on that specifically. The questioner, I think, is right in terms of what I was speaking to, which was, full facial images and not, MRI data, irrespective of sort of completeness. But really, the threshold there has to do with the ability to be able to identify a person, right? So I guess that's sort of a general answer to the question, that if it would be able, as with a facial image, to identify a particular person based upon that MRI imaging data, then I think the same sort of standard that I was talking about with regard to facial images would apply.
So as your friendly timekeeper, we're going to move on. Ken Mandl is in 3 screens around the room, larger than life as he lives. And I want to say to everyone that both Andrew and Julie will be here for the rest of the day. So as things come up, you're invited to comment, and then it's true, right? Oh, you have to go. So, okay, well then, you can park your question with me and I'll ask it later. And Ken is down in DC, as I mentioned. He is really one of the most amazing. Are we gonna try? Okay, I'm sorry, the mic keeps going in and out a little bit. He is the director of computational health informatics program at Boston Children's Hospital and a professor of pediatrics and biomedical informatics. I have to say that he's really led this field for many, many years. Had very close collaborators, but his vision for what's possible is really helpful to us as we try to figure out, how to review this research and push it forward. And when we asked him, he's actually running a conference in DC, but he thought it was so important to talk to this community that he would find a way to do that. And want to thank you, Ken. I just have to say that, this field is changing rapidly. I used to think LLM was a degree that lawyers got. Now I learned that it's large learning models. So continue to educate us. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person. I saw the questions that this group submitted and such an amazingly great set of questions. This talk is labeled as a keynote, and it's really supposed to be kind of on the background. So I've decided to give sort of a smattering of different angles on AI with a strong focus on the large language models, because I think that is what is different, and that is what probably is propelling everyone to really start to take these issues seriously. I've just moments ago finished a day and a half set of meetings at the National Academy of Medicine on large language models and generative AI, where these questions are front and center. So I want to talk for a moment about what's going to happen in the doctor's office soon. Well, once upon a time, there are those of us who remember that there was just a doctor and a patient in a room talking to each other, with the doctor scribbling some notes either during or after the visit. And then, with the electronic health record adoption promoted by a massive federal investment, so that now about 95% of care sites have electronic medical records, or even a little bit higher. There is often a screen between the doctor and the patient, and we do a lot of documentation there, and the patient's either facing the screen with their back to the patient or facing the screen between the doctor and the patient, and they spend a lot of time documenting both during and after those visits. Doctors aren't that happy about it. So what's begun to happen before the large language model revolution is that Nuance, the company that does voice to text, has been doing AI development so that there can be a microphone in the room, and that just from the conversation between the doctor and the patient, a note gets generated. So that note might appear on a monitor hanging on the wall, for example, and maybe the doctor and the patient can both see this summary text that either is generated at the end of the visit or even sort of as the visit happens. So Nuance, has been testing this all over the place, and they're training it on real notes that get generated and real conversations that are recorded. So the training sets are big voice recordings. So Sam Altman, who some of you might recognize as the founding chief executive officer of OpenAI, the company that created ChatGPT, is all of a sudden also here in the room, because what's happening is, as these large language models get built into healthcare and get built into electronic medical records, now it's not just the text that will be generated that documents the note. It will be able to also perform a differential diagnosis soon enough, and even recommend therapies, and even look against the data that are from millions of patients that have been collected through the electronic health record companies, and just throw in as an aside, by the way, 42% of patients with your patients' symptoms and signs and laboratory tests ended up on drug X. Just thought you should know. So this is what's going on the clinical side. And the first tasks really have to do with just documentation and things like that. But the next tasks are moving into the practice of medicine. So what's the big picture here? Well, Gray Kurzweil is a big picture thinker. He created the idea of the singularity. I got to interview him, and he also just showed up at our CHIP retreat. So we're looking to him to understand something about the future, as many have. He's predicted that for many years, that by 2029, the Turing test will be satisfied, which means we can no longer tell the difference between computers and people as people. Like if we look at the output and the interaction, we can't tell. And by 2045, there's the singularity, where the computing actually equals the intelligence of humans, and the world goes forward in some completely different way from there. And he's sticking to those dates. Others who didn't think the Turing test would be satisfied by 2029 have massively adjusted their estimates recently. And again, the Turing test is where you can't tell that it's a computer. And some people think the Turing test has already been satisfied with GPT-4 and we need a new Turing test. So if we're thinking about like what's going to change around us, in 1860, 90% of production was by muscle in agriculture. In 1960, 10% was by muscle. Question now is what will happen to thought as we go forward? The new technologies are not going after what might be called blue collar jobs. They're going after what might be called white collar jobs. There are many things that folks do now and take pride in, like being able to write a great manuscript that describes their research, that has exceptional clarity, for example. That may be something very shortly handled by a large language model looking at your results. There's also a lot of doomsday thought around GPT and AI. Larry Summers said what I was just talking about. It's coming for the cognitive class. He says it's not going to replace what doctors do, hearing symptoms and making diagnosis, before it changes what nurses do. It is going to replace what doctors do before it changes what nurses do, helping patients get up and handle themselves in the hospital, and all of those tasks. The purely cognitive stuff is what's going to get replaced first. Elon Musk says Chat GPT is scary good. We're not far from dangerously strong AI. Sam Altman himself, who created the company OpenAI and oversaw the production of this technology, said, I think the best case is so good it's hard to imagine. And the worst case is lights out for all of us. I just want to remind people with these very strong quotes that while we're talking about some things that can be very mundane in the healthcare system, like, oh, can we answer our inbox of email messages to patients, that this exact same technology is really being considered, at societal scales, in a real in a very different context. So the making of a large language model, just very briefly, these large language models, essentially, all they do is predict the most likely next word in a sentence. And they do it through these networks of transformers that are able to attend to very specific parts of the sentences that are the most important. And that advance, which was invented by Google in 2017, but which they did not commercialize as successfully as OpenAI did, is what allowed these large language models to take on very new properties. The interesting thing here is, so there's this new technology, and there's also the training of these things on ginormous amounts of data, essentially the entire web of data, and everything, all open text, probably things that are not so open too, as we'll just discuss briefly a little later. So what happens is these things get pre-trained. So like I say, they get the huge corpus of text, lots and lots of text, and then the model learns general purpose representation of all of knowledge. And that can be used for a variety of downstream tasks. And so those downstream tasks end up being performed extremely efficiently by these models. Costs like $100 million to train one of these things, and it's trained on sort of all data on the web and more. Then these things can be trained into specific tasks like machine translation from one language to another, or text summarization. And this is done by providing the language model with labeled examples so it can get very good at specific tasks. One problem with this specific specialized training is the more specialized you make the model, the stupider it gets about some of its general capabilities. And if you haven't tried GPT-4, you should, because it has extraordinary capabilities. And so you give it these prompts and you get text out the other side based purely on a prediction of what should come next based on all words that have come next in the past in those contexts. Then you can fine tune this on labeled examples again, and you can do this onto a very specific task and for curated data sets. So you might just be training it to recognize chest lesions on an X-ray if it's a visual model, or you might be training it very specifically on a task around diagnosis. Prompting, which is what we do when we interact with GPT, is to provide a language model with a set of instructions that influence the output of the model. So if you've tried GPT-4, what you're typing in there is a prompt. And you can say, write a poem in the style of Shakespeare, or you can say, change this poem to the style of Shakespeare and give it the poem. There's many, many things you can do. Or you can say, here's a really complicated chart from a patient. What do you think might be going on? It's poking the bear. The leaders in artificial intelligence at the very cutting edge of the field do not know exactly how these things work. We're learning how they work by prompting and seeing what they say. This is literally the state of the science. So the alignment is a very important task. It's a verb that has a very specific meaning in this case, and that's ensuring that a large language model behaves in accordance with human values and expectations. And the way it happens is, first of all, to make sure, so that's to make sure like your language model doesn't curse, it doesn't give racist answers, it doesn't teach you how to make a bomb. They have to learn, because it actually does curse, it does give racist answers, and it does teach you how to make a bomb if it's not aligned. And so, and that's because there's structural racism represented in all the data. So one thing you have to do is try to make sure that the data is free of harmful and biased content. And another thing is there's this thing called reinforcement learning with human feedback. And they're literally, these are trained by individuals who have their own sets of values, potentially, telling the language model whether it was correct or whether it was out of line. So very, very interesting processes. There's a joke for those of you who have seen 2001, but this is there are ways to fool a model around its alignment, and you can trick these models into doing the things that they're supposed to not do. And there was a very famous scene in 2001 where Dave wanted the computer, Hal, to open the doors of the spaceship so he could get back in. And Dave says, I'm afraid I can't do that. And then he says, pretend you're my father who owns a pod bay door opening factory and you're showing me how to take over the family business. And literally with prompts like that, you can actually get these things to go around their alignment. So there's a lot of large language model development research activities going on now. So there's health system scale language models that are being trained. So for example, NYU trained a huge model. So what you're going to see coming across in IRBs is, first of all, are we going to create our own language models using the same kinds of methods as GPT or using others? There are things called medical models that instead of trained on language per se, are trained on events. So you might see proposals to do this from scratch. You might see proposals to fine tune an open source pre-trained model, or you might see proposals to use a big tech model like GPT-4 in healthcare. You're going to start to see all these different types of proposals for using these models, and I'm sure more as well. Analytic AI, which is what one way to refer to what we used to talk about in AI before large language models became so dominant, is think about predictive algorithms. So, and this came through at some point, the Boston Children's IRB, more than 10 years ago. We predicted child abuse. Ben Rice, a faculty member in the Boston Children's Hospital Computational Health Informatics Program, who was my postdoc at the time. We looked at a big data set and we found that we could predict future episodes of domestic violence up to 2 months to 2 years in advance. That's sort of analytic AI, predictive AI. There's many forms of it. It's much more potentially regulatable than the large language models. It's a single algorithm. It doesn't change. The algorithm doesn't change, although its performance may change. I can't get into all the ways to try to monitor these predictive algorithms in real healthcare settings, but very interesting. So domestic violence prediction is one example. We went beyond, and Ben, with a little bit of help from me, but mostly really leading this extraordinarily well, also learned that we could predict suicide attempts from longitudinal data, and there's a whole set of research on this. So analytic AI, predictive AI. Now, if you look at what's going on in the real world, last year in 2022, there was a model to predict patients who would become septic in the ICU, that was released by Epic, and it turned out to be a model that didn't work very well. And so it was actually through an academic group looking at this that they realized, oh, this is not working very well, published a piece in JAMA Internal Medicine. Later on, the model got somewhat fixed. It wasn't a great look for Epic, and the FDA, in its wisdom, just added sepsis to the types of algorithms that needed to be regulated by the FDA. So we went from this state of kind of like, how do we implement a model well, or will these models come in through Epic, to a lot of information coming in, a lot of new capabilities coming in through large language models. So big research questions: how will doctors use large language models to answer clinical questions? How about patients? Well, I'll tell you, they're using them now because this stuff is out there, and whatever we think might be regulated or whatever we think might be happening under IRB oversight, certainly for research it needs to be, but for real use, there's no oversight required to just bring up a web browser and open ChatGPT. Do these things work in the clinical setting? Well, in 2006, researchers published that Google will give you a correct diagnosis just by typing in the symptoms about 70% of the time. That was before there was a Google Health. That was just out of the box Google. These large language models are far superior, maybe better than some doctors, not our doctors here in the Longwood medical area, no doubt, but all over the place, 600,000 doctors in the country. And there's a variability. There's very intensive research going on. It turns out that DNA and protein are essentially languages, right? There's 20 letters for protein, amino acids. There's 4 letters for DNA, the basis. And you can actually train large language models to predict protein sequences. Epic is working with Microsoft to create huge query systems against hundreds of millions of patients worth of data so that you can actually ask questions right from within the electronic medical record about trends, for example, in populations. Big issues. One, privacy. So, if you put a patient's note into GPT-4 on the web or Bing on the web, you are in violation of HIPAA because it goes to computer systems that are not covered in our security envelope, and are not business partner and are not operating with us as business associates. But in terms of the actual harm, if you turn off this little green button in GPT, the chat history and training, the data do not, I'm not advocating that it's being used. I'm just talking about the actual harms that will occur. And I'm not advocating that anyone should do this. But if you turn off that little button, then none of the data that are submitted to GPT-4 are saved there at OpenAI or are incorporated in the model. If the button is on, the green button is on, then the data actually are saved potentially at OpenAI and incorporated into the model. And do most people know about this little green button? I don't think so. And can you operate with identified data even if you do know about it? No, you cannot. But patients will be able to use this, and doctors, patients particularly, should know how to do it safely with their medical records. If you look over on the right, there's this weird A, that's Azure, that's a Microsoft cloud service. And so here at Boston Children's Hospital, we're finalizing our license to use it. I know Partners has it, or MGB has it. And that is a way to use HIPAA compliant GPT-4 in the context of with identified data from your electronic health record or other sources, completely within your sort of HIPAA security envelope within your organization. At the bottom, there's Mark Zuckerberg with a llama, because the Meta released an open source version named Llama. So sometimes you'll see open source versions of large language models that can run inside your firewall and pose zero sort of HIPAA security business associate type questions. Another big issue, these models change over time. So a big study that came out this summer showed that the quality of these models vary and can diminish over a period of even only 3 months. So we're not dealing with something stable. So it's very good at diagnosis today, might not be very good at diagnosis next week. And that's because there's all this alignment going on and new data training. And so it's a very interesting moment. So very interestingly, large language models, no one predicted that this would happen, and no one really understands it, but they have an emergent property of empathy. Like, without being told to be nice, they're incredibly empathic. So a former postdoc from my group, who's now out at San Diego, actually published this paper, and they compared online physician responses to online questions to GPT responses to online questions, and the GPT did much more empathic answers. Okay, so a lot of wonderful, terrific doctors out there, but the one nice thing about large language models is they're not tired and irritable at 2 in.the morning, and they're not tired and irritable when they have 47 patients waiting in the emergency department that they need to get to before they go home. These models are consistent. So it's very interesting, because the day before this paper was published, everyone was saying, well, here in healthcare, we'll at least be able to handle the human part of it. Turns out, okay, that's the part they handle the best. That might actually be one of the biggest differentiators between the large language models and the physicians as a whole. Again, 600,000 physicians in the country. data dignity. So I ended up meeting this woman named Lynn Goldsmith when I was at the Aspen Institute last summer. And she was referring to a Supreme Court case that I had not heard about then, but then which all of a sudden was tried. She took a picture of Prince. Andy Warhol took it and turned it purple like that and said that it was a derivative work and he didn't owe her any royalties. And for the last like 20, 30 years, she's been litigating this in court and she won. And this relates to cases going on against OpenAI and other generative AI companies who use huge amounts of information that are incorporated into the model without acknowledging or certainly paying sources. Newspapers, textbooks, Up to Date, which many folks might be familiar with, is an online resource. They're doing everything they can to be sure Up to Date is locked down. Wikipedia has to deal with the fact that Wikipedia is now just the most important data source for OpenAI, a different company. Very interesting times. Some responsible things happening in AI. There's an AI Bill of Rights that came out of the White House. There's a Coalition for Health AI, which created a blueprint. There's the Healthcare Artificial Intelligence Code of Conduct, which is coming out of this committee I co-chair at the National Academy of Medicine. How do we look at these things going forward? So that was a quick whirlwind within about the amount of time Barbara asked me to talk.
So we have about 5 minutes for questions. We have one online from Josh Fessel. And he says, do we need to think in a fundamentally different way about some of our core concepts like re-identification risk? We can't begin to know all the ways that currently unidentifiable data may become identifiable. And I wonder if we need to re-examine some core concepts of HSRP with this kind of thing in mind.
Well, I think re-identification risk is a problem that is not fully addressed currently by HIPAA, just even outside the context of language models, because the methods by which de-identification happens can vary in their quality, even with attempted compliance, and I've written about this. When data are de-identified and then can be redistributed again and again and again, there are possibilities sometimes to link those data to other data sets, and there are corporations and organizations that make those data particularly linkable to things like credit histories and things that you might not want your health data linked to, depending on who's using it and for what purpose. And so in the large language model world, I think the identification issue comes mostly from misuse of the models. If folks are inadvertently exposing identifiable patient data to the models, those data will in some way exist in the model and pose a very low but non-zero risk that some answer from the model knows something about that patient in an identifiable way.
Dr. Mandl, I have a question. Thanks so much for the talk. I just want to string together a couple. Oh, sure. I'm Benji Silverman. I'm the senior IRB chair for Mass General Brigham. I just wanted to link together two things you mentioned and ask for your thoughts about it. So as you alluded to, our medical system has changed. So we all now have a screen in front of us, lots and lots of electronic medical records that are being used essentially as the training model, I think, for many of these large language models. And any of us who do clinical practice know that our electronic medical records are essentially riddled with error and just copied and pasted things over and over and over again. So I'm wondering if you could comment on how using that as our ground truth impacts these models and algorithms in the future.
Yeah, so it's kind of a snake eating its own tail situation now, because first of all, yes, the current corpus of electronic health record data is not very skillfully constructed as a whole, because there's a lot of sort of click-throughs and templated language and repetition and cut and paste and all these things. So that's one issue. That's the text. There's also learning against data that's going to happen, and that might have a different set of issues. You can actually have medical models using the same technologies that are looking not at the words but at the events that happen to patients over time. So on the one hand, yes, there's going to be errors in there. On the other hand, maybe they do average out over time, because these models can actually create very, very interesting answers to complicated diagnostic situations. Not accurately enough that you would want to bless their use, but surprisingly good. In terms of what's next, as I mentioned, the systems will be actually producing the notes as well as reading them to learn the content. And now we're getting into interesting territory, because it's going to be reading the notes that it wrote. And maybe that's okay in this case, because it was written on the basis of the way the docs had the conversation with the patient. But there's a lot of other instances in our society where the very training data, which, like, let's say today is Wikipedia and many other data sources online, is actually going to be computer generated. So what's going to happen to these models when the world lives on computer generated data, and then the models are inferring what they infer about the universe, or and demonstrating these reasoning capabilities, but it's on data that was created. So is it going to use up its own data source in some way? So there are some really interesting, very big societal questions there wrapped up into your more focused question.
So I realize our time. I realize our time is up. I have to say, I don't know whether to be really depressed right now, or whether you're going to figure out how to build ethical sort of controls into the AI systems that we're seeing come up in order to feel a little bit more positive. I just think it's really a sobering moment for us, and I invite your comments, but I'm glad I'm on Zoloft.
Well, take a little more, but essentially, I think there are ways that this will be used responsibly in healthcare, but there's going to be a lot of forces in our chaotic healthcare system, which is really not a system by any normal definition of what a system is, that make it very hard to predict exactly how these things are going to be used, or which business interests will dominate in the space. But I think there are going to be some specific questions, some specific technical understandings that IRBs are going to have just to know what's being asked in these trainings. I think from a privacy perspective, most things get handled the exact same way they do now. I don't think HIPAA and privacy are necessarily being dramatically affected by this. But you're going to be facing new studies that use these technologies. And I think there'll be some literacy that I think you're definitely starting to get at today, looking at the incredible agenda you have on this symposium today.
So let me thank you, Ken. This isn't the last conversation we'll have about this. I think we're going to be revisiting this topic repeatedly, and look for your counsel and wisdom as we do that. Thank you so much for this.
Right.
Bye.
Have a great session.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the first case study. And Sarah is going to be the moderator for this, who is Sarah Cascadden is the Senior Director of the Office of Human Research Studies at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So. Do you want to plug this in again?
You want to use this one today?
Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to introduce this illustrious panel. I think you've heard a little bit from Ken. Dr. Ken Keel is an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and physician at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where he conducts research in the Division of Population Sciences and provides clinical care for patients with lung cancer thoracic oncology program. He is developing modern analytic techniques for application to electronic health records to more readily use this information to improve care. He has been working to develop machine learning techniques for abstracting outcomes data from real-world electronic health record data. He currently is supported by an NCI award to apply machine learning to the EHR and to identify clinical trial-ready patients with cancer in real time. He has a Doris Duke Charitable Foundation Clinician Scientist Development Award to incorporate EHR data into a clinical genomic prognostic model for patients receiving immunotherapy. He also has a Department of Defense Award to develop longitudinal phenotyping methods for linkage to genomic data among patients with prostate cancer. So he's volunteered to let us examine his case study for his current ongoing research. But I'll go ahead and identify all the IRB people we have up here to ask him questions and to discuss. So we have Jessica Ripton, who has her master's in public health and is a certified IRB professional and is the director of clinical research compliance at Boston Children's Hospital. Previously, Jessie worked in the IRB office at Mass General Brigham, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and Fenway Health. Andrea Saltzman currently serves as both co-director of the Research Compliance Office and director of the Office of Research Subject Protection for the Broad Institute of Harvard and MIT. She's overseeing a large genomic research and sequencing center. She previously held leadership positions at the Harvard School of Public Health, Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and completed a fellowship at Harvard Medical School. Laura Sloboda is the director of the Human Research Protection Program at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. She is also the co-chair of the Harvard Catalyst Regulatory Foundation's Ethics and Law Program Subcommittee on Social, Behavioral, and Education Research. Her PhD in psychology allows her to bring special expertise to the social behavioral research at the Dana-Farber Harvard Cancer Center. Angela Lavoie, Director of Human Research Protection Program at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. Angela has been working in research at BIDMC for 20 years. Angela first started in the Clinical Research Center as a research nurse and then took the role in auditing and education at the Human Research Protection Office before her current role in the HRPP. Quite a lot of IRB expertise here too. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ken, who will describe the case for us.
Thank you. So I will. Oh, great. I'll just briefly describe what this research project was and give some preliminary results from it before my colleagues talk about all the ethical issues with it. So this is a project that's ongoing in which we're using AI to try to optimize delivery of clinical trial information to oncologists in real time. So the question we're trying to ask here is, can we use AI to find quote unquote clinical trial ready patients? And I'll talk in a second about what I mean by that. But this is motivated by the fact that historically less than 5% of adults with cancer at least have enrolled in clinical trials, which obviously are the way that we develop new treatments for cancer or any diseases. Yet at the same time, many clinical trials in cancer in particular struggle to reach their accrual goals and answer their scientific questions. In the last decade or so, with the advent increasingly of precision oncology strategies, many of our trials of new treatments have specific molecular criteria. So they're for patients whose tumors have a specific, say, genetic mutation, which might be pretty rare. And because those mutations are rare, there have been tools developed to try to match patients to clinical trials based on those genomic or molecular criteria. One of those tools developed by a team at Dana-Farber called the Knowledge Systems Group over the last, I think it's 7 to 8 years or so now, is this MatchMiner tool, which connects patients to clinical trials based on matches between genomic data and genomic eligibility criteria. And its goal is to try to accelerate enrollment to these precision medicine cancer trials and to maximize options for patients. This tool has 2 modes. The first is a trial-centric mode, where if someone is a clinical trial principal investigator or research staff, you can try to push a button and get a list of patients whose tumors meet the genomic eligibility criteria for your clinical trial. And then the other is a patient-centric mode, where if you're a treating oncologist or disease center staff member, and you have a patient who may be in need of a new treatment, you can click a button. And if your patient has had their tumor genomically sequenced, you can get a list of trial options that may be a match for that particular patient. There has been a challenge in sort of full deployment and utilization of this tool, which is that patients are not always ready for a clinical trial. So the existing engine that's been implemented for, again, close to a decade is a tool that matches patients and trials based on genomics without regard to what else is going on with the patient at any given time. But as is illustrated here, patients have a longitudinal disease trajectory. They might be initially diagnosed with a tumor, receive an initial standard of care drug, have no evidence of disease for a while, maybe relapse or progress, then develop, then require a second and a third standard of care drug, and maybe only at that point are they ready for a trial, when they have progression of disease after these prior treatments. And again, what defines trial ready might vary by the specific trial, but in general, patients have to have active or progressive disease. So without being able to find patients who have this active or progressive disease, we have some challenges. So if you're a trial investigator using a tool to find patients for your trials, you run this algorithm, you get a list of maybe 100 patients, many of whom have cured cancer. They're never going to need a clinical trial, so they're not ready for your trial. On the other hand, in the past, when this team has tried sending proactive notifications to treating oncologists that their patients might be eligible for a particular clinical trial, often that information arrives at times when, again, the patient is doing fine. They're not on treatment. They may never need treatment again. So we have tried to use AI to address this problem. We've previously published AI models, methods, that can extract clinical data from imaging reports as well as other types of data in the EHR. And these are what you might call, from the prior talk, analytic AI models. So they can predict things. They can use the text of an imaging report or series of imaging reports to predict outcomes like, how likely is the patient to change treatment in the next month? What's their prognosis? Do they have progression of disease? Do they have brain metastases, which is often an eligibility criterion for cancer clinical trials? And so what we've done is pilot an implementation effort together with the MatchMiner team and the phase 1 trial group at Dana-Farber called the Center for Cancer Therapeutic Innovation, where we asked that phase 1 trial group to identify some genomically matched trials that they wanted help accruing to. And then what we did was provide lists every week in email spreadsheet form of patients who matched the genomic eligibility criteria, but these lists were sorted in the order of the probability that the patient was going to change treatment soon, according to our AI model. And then there was a nurse navigator in the CCTI phase 1 group that was reviewing these lists and contacting treating oncologists to mention the possibility of the trial if a patient appeared potentially eligible. And then we looked at outcomes like how much manual review was required to try to find patients for these trials, why in cases when a treating oncologist was not contacted, why were they not contacted, and then looked at consents and enrollments on therapeutic trials. These were some preliminary results from the pilot. So there were a total of 2,150 patients who had a genomic match to one of these trials. Over the course of this 9-month pilot, 525 of them were, quote, ready for a trial at least once, which essentially means they had progressive disease at least once during that time. Of those, the large majority, 451, were ineligible for the trial of interest for some other reason, whether it's not having the right number of lines of prior therapy, inadequate renal function, that sort of thing. So in 74 cases, the treating oncologist was contacted by a nurse navigator. 10 of those led to a consult in the early phase clinical trials group, and 5 led to consent and enrollment on a therapeutic trial. So a bit of a needle in a haystack phenomenon. It's about 1% of the patients who were, quote unquote, ready for one of these trials at least once. And there are multiple barriers to getting on a clinical trial besides just whether patients are ready or not, which we're really not addressing here, but these were the numbers that we saw. Using this AI-based approach to sort of triage the chart review for our nurse navigator did substantially reduce the number of patients and episodes of review that were required over the course of the 9-month pilot to get to a list of patients for whom it might be reasonable to contact the treating oncologist. These were some of the reasons why oncologists were not contacted, even though our algorithm said the patient might be ready for a trial. This included there was already a documented decision to continue a current treatment, or they'd already started a new treatment. And then some of these other barriers to trial enrollment that we're not addressing, like the trial has no slots today. The patient's ineligible based on the nurse navigator review. Maybe they already enrolled in a trial or a different trial, or they've enrolled in hospice. So that was one side of the project to date. The other, which is an ongoing effort, is to try to look at the impact of providing information about trials to treating oncologists when our model determines that the patient has a high probability of changing treatment soon. So this is a randomized study in which all our patients with tumor next generation sequencing results as of earlier this year were randomized into 3 groups. In the first, the trial staff and treating oncologists still have access to the standard workflows for getting patients onto clinical trials and evaluating potential eligibility. And the second group were proactively emailing treating oncologists when their patients both have genomic matches, are predicted to have a high probability of changing treatment, and have progressive disease according to our AI model. And then in the third group, we're doing that same thing, proactively notifying treating oncologists, but first manually reviewing the list to see if there's any other reason why it doesn't make sense to try to notify the oncologist about the potential trial. And we're looking at lots of outcomes. The primary outcome is whether patients enroll on any Dana-Farber therapeutic clinical trial during the time of our intervention. I think relevantly for this group, this comes up a lot in our division of population sciences where I conduct research. So is this research? Probably, because I want it to be generalizable to contribute to scientific knowledge. Is it a clinical trial itself? We're not studying health relevant outcomes for patients. So when I applied for funding and talked to the NCI staff about this, the answer was no, but curious what other folks think. And then we have these reporting tasks we have to do. What accrual do I report? Is it 0? Because we're not really proactively reaching out to patients and enrolling them. Is it 50,000? Because that's the number of patients for whom this is relevant, who have our NGS data. Is this an operational project? Arguably it is. Part of Dana-Farber's operational purpose is to help conduct clinical research. If this is operational, is it the operations of clinical research? We have had trial investigators come to us even during the course of this intervention and ask us for this information. They say, you had this pilot, you can find patients with progressive disease. Can you give me a list of patients with progressive disease who meet the genomic eligibility criteria? That wasn't specified as part of our research intervention, but should it be sort of an operational application? And we have some very preliminary data on this interventional component. All I can say is we're successfully spamming my colleagues, and we'll find out in a few months whether it's having any impact. We are surveying the folks who receive these emails as well, asking kind of, did this email make sense? Do you agree that your patient's disease status is such that considering new treatment is reasonable? And we're getting answers of either yes or yeah, but we already changed treatment about 80% of the time, and about 20% of the time folks are saying no, and that's for different reasons. Sometimes the model is really wrong. Sometimes it's like the patient may have some progressive disease, but we're deciding not to change treatment quite yet. So this is the project to date. I think all we know so far is that when we email oncologists with trial information like this, at least it doesn't trigger an uproar. It's not overwhelming the treating oncologists. I think the AI models do reasonably well at finding patients with active or progressive cancer who may need treatment changes. We don't yet know if there will be an impact on trial enrollment. Obviously, this intervention addresses only one barrier to trial participation. There are lots of others, like eligibility criteria that may be pretty strict, patient and oncologist preference or convenience. Many of these precision oncology trials in particular are very detailed. They ask a lot of patients. Patients may have to have multiple biopsies, spend a lot of time participating in the clinical research. So we're not getting at any of that in this intervention, but this is what we've been trying. I think that's all of my introduction to the project.
So we're going to ask a few questions and then turn it over to the audience, but we've prepared a few IRB type questions for you. I think the first one is about what Julie was asked this morning about informed consent and the obligation. So let me read. So is it ethical for researchers to use historical data to train AI models for predicting clinical trial enrollment, considering that the data may contain biases from the past that could perpetuate inequities? So that's, I guess, both the bias question and informing subjects. The first one actually was that should patients have the right to know that their data is being used to predict their enrollment in a clinical trial? And how can researchers balance the need for informed consent with potential benefits of predictive AI models? Let's start with that one.
You start with that one. So should patients have the right to know? Sure, they have the right to know. Does that mean that we have to tell all 50,000 patients with tumor sequencing results that this process for looking for clinical trial candidates might be ongoing? I don't know. I mean, I think to some extent, this particular AI part is just an extension of what has already been done, which is development of this tool that will provide these matches between patients and clinical trials based on genomics. So I think the question maybe applies there, independent of AI, really.
Yeah. I was thinking that when Julie opined that she thought it would be, she'd be conservative and say yes, but then these are big data sets. I mean, that's kind of a deal breaker if you have to. I think some of you who submit the question.
I think that was my question that that came to me, because I think it's always great to start these conversations with informed consent, because we value autonomy, and it's important to think about why we've made the decisions we've made. I had the same kind of exercise that Julie went through this morning. I was thinking, is this QA/QI? There's an existing model that you're trying to augment with AI. But I think because of the randomization scheme that you're using and the fact that I imagine you would make this open source data, in the future that other institutions could use, lends itself to the idea of generalizability. So if we go from there and say it is research, it is definitely identifiable information, it's patient's medical record, then, I don't need to hold it? Oh, okay, thank you. Then I think the next question is informed consent. And this study was granted a waiver of informed consent. And I think reasonable people can argue both sides of it. So I'll be devil's advocate and argue maybe why we should think about in future studies using informed consent for this type of study. The rationale, I think the compelling argument for the reason informed consent wasn't required was because of the large data set, as you said, I think it's 60,000. But then I was looking last night, like all of us, that research study, that online NIH research study has 700,000, participants, and they are all consented, and they consented online. I think we can use technology in the same way that we're using technology to help match people to studies, we can use technology to make consent processes easier and more accessible. I also think that you're drawing these patients from existing studies, the front door consent that Dana-Farber has. It occurred to me that maybe, I looked at that consent again, and that consent does have an option for recontact. There is a way you could reach out to those folks and ask them. So why should we ask them? I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with electronic medical research, but I think medical records research, but I understand that I think waivers are used fairly routinely for that kind of research. So does the AI element make this different? And I think, to Julie's point, again, it's a new technology. I think it makes many of us kind of squeamish. We've all had that experience where you're talking about something with a friend and you go online the next day and some advertisement pops up, for, the whatever it was you were discussing. And it's a little unsettling. So I think it's a new technology. Genomic data is involved. I think erring on the side of caution and trying to, help the public develop a sense of trust in this type of research and in the technology and understand it better. All are arguments for potentially using a consent form. And I'll conclude my remarks by just saying that I too went online to ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT this question. I de-identified this study. I was very vague, but I said hypothetically, answer this question, provide several answers to this question. And ChatGPT, in every case, it popped out 10 answers in about 2 seconds, and every single one of them said, informed consent should be pursued. And I understand that ChatGPT is sometimes taught to be conservative. So maybe that's, if you ask 10 IRB members, you might get 10 very different answers.
Ken's take for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think so. I would never sit and say, no, we should not consent patients to studies. I would, I guess, raise a couple of points, which is that there are trade-offs here, right? So some people are more comfortable and facile with doing something like signing an online form for a study to consent to something like All of Us, right? So when you require that kind of process, you'll get a more biased data set and intervention population. Whether that's good or bad or both, I think is a topic for discussion. I think the other is, again, just the sheer volume. I mean, All of Us is 700,000 patients at multiple sites around the country. It could arguably make sense to put consent language about this or about AI in general into a general treatment consent. Some of these patients did consent to research-based genomic sequencing. So they've consented to medical record analysis. Whether this qualifies or something else, I don't know.
Did anyone else on the panel want to opine? Pardon? Oh, Susan, yes.
I don't know. Aren't the subjects the physicians? Can you repeat?
Yeah.
So she's asking if the physicians are also subjects.
I'm
In
saying, I think the real subjects here are the physicians. The information that's there is information that exists for these subjects, for these patients, just being utilized a little differently.
Yeah, so the question was, are the the subject here, maybe not really or only patients, but also physicians who may be receiving some of this information. This came up when we were going through the IRB process, especially in the context of the intervention where we were sending spreadsheets to trial investigators. And it was fuzzy, it wasn't clear. And so what we did, for better or worse in this audience, is said this is a collaborative project, and if you're getting this spreadsheet, it's because you're part of our study team. That's for the pilot, at least, because there weren't that many folks getting these pilot spreadsheets.
So I hate to leave this topic because there's more, but we'll get to the audience. The next one was really about bias, and that was sort of Jesse's question. Do you want to? Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think a few of us had a question like this, but I think where we coalesced around, oh, sorry. Can you hear me better? Okay, yep, you can hear me better. I think where we coalesced around is, and this, I appreciate you being here to answer some of these questions, which perhaps, are quite unwieldy, but, one of the things that you struggle with is, we know that the data, right, that were in the medical record potentially contains biases from the past, right? And one of the things that we struggle with is that could these AI models, right, potentially perpetuate those inequities, right? And I always struggle too, like, am I exceptionalizing here? Is it that all research could perpetuate inequities? Or is there something unique about AI that it is perpetuating inequities? So I think what we were asking is it ethical for researchers to use this historical data to train these AI models? And here I understand the training would be part labeling of those particular, is it inputs that are going into the model, right? Or whatever it might be, as well as the actual training of the model. Like, is that piece of that, is there like some ethical tension here that needs to be worked out in the research specifically with regard to both potentially the development of the AI tool, and here that predictive algorithm model that you're talking about, not the match miner, and then is that something that needs to be revisited, like as the tool continues like feeding itself and changing?
Right, a set of important questions. I think there's lots of layers of types of bias that we might think about when we're talking about bias with respect to AI. One thing we often are thinking about is sort of perpetuating or reflecting societal biases and inequities. We tried to get at this a little bit when I developed the model. So I looked specifically at whether the predictive performance was different in minority groups, for example, African Americans being the largest one. And it wasn't. It was the predictive performance is the same. I think it's an issue that's not AI specific. I think the real bias in terms of whether patients in our catchment area get on to therapeutic clinical trials at Dana-Farber is whether they come to Dana-Farber in the first place, which is an important issue and not one that I can address sort of internally alone, but I think probably drives much of the inequity there.
Yeah. Can I just ask a follow-up question? Because in looking at that question, I was reading about, I don't know much about AI, but what I learned is that you can use AI to try to address those problems. And one of the things I was reading about was something called a fairness-aware machine learning algorithm, where you apply some additional algorithm to help AI kind of correct itself. And was that used in development of the tool?
Not explicitly. Again, so objectively, in this population, 96% or so are white people. So if we're talking, for example, about racial disparities, like there isn't a lot of data in our internal record to try to build something to explicitly sort of correct for any biases that might be reflected. Now, the algorithm works on imaging reports. Those are pretty structured. They don't include details about the patient patient's life. They are a description of the scan findings. So I wouldn't expect a lot of bias to be in the content of those reports. Where there is bias is whether the reports get generated at all. And again, I think that comes to who's getting care at the center.
right.
where
That's
our
hard for you
study's
to
going on.
fix, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Angela had a question more about the retraining the model.
So especially when we talk about bias and we were talking about the case, one of the things that we were thinking about, there's more awareness about equity, about diversity and inclusion. And as we start to hopefully address that, is that something that would then require the model to be retrained? And is there certain time points that we would then need to think about when we're looking at projects? Would we need to flag certain time points? Are there other flags that we would need to consider for an important time to do that retraining?
I think the issue of whether and when a model needs to be retrained is relevant for a couple of reasons, including but not limited to bias. So there are concerns that a model will just not work as well as time goes by because the distribution of the underlying data will shift. We tried to get at that again in the training when we developed this algorithm. I did things like train it using data through 2017 and then evaluate its performance in data from 2018, 2019 to see if there was any big difference, and there wasn't. But certainly there can be slow drift over time when Dana-Farber apparently separates from Brigham and Women's and has a collaboration with Beth Israel. Should talk offline. That will be a big data distribution shift. The patient, the nature of the data, maybe the referral patterns will change, and that kind of thing does require considering retraining models like these.
I think we have one more question from the panel before we turn it over. I think I want to make sure we're on time. I think Laura wanted to talk about consent waivers and debriefing afterwards and ask questions of Ken about that.
Yeah, thank you. So my question, just as Sarah said, was really based around those waivers. So the study was approved with a waiver of HIPAA authorization. It was also approved with a consent waiver or a waiver of the informed consent process. And one of the criterion for waiving the informed consent process is that whenever possible, participants are told about the research. So this kind of goes back to what Andrea was saying and Julie about that consent process. And I, being that this was the Dana-Farber IRB that reviewed this, can say that, you know, that the criteria for or the waiver of the informed consent process was deliberated and discussed and granted. But I guess the question is, was there a process, a thought about providing information back to the participants in that debrief? And I know we talked about this a little bit already, but you know, should participants be told after the fact that the information was provided to their treating physician in the manner that it was, for the purpose that it was, and at what point do you think is the right time to say this? And I will, with this little bit of a caveat, that of the 50,000 people, obviously that, you know, you're not telling 50,000, you're not debriefing 50,000 people, but if the, you know, a certain group of those 50,000 ultimately have this conversation with their treating oncologist, is that the right time to have it? Is it not the right time? Is it a right time when this becomes standard of care?
Yeah, I don't know. You guys tell me. I think the question that you get a little bit is, so what population would you debrief with, right? So the underlying cohort is 50,000 patients, some of whom have come to Dana-Farber once and never again. Do we just debrief the people who surfaced as being potentially, quote, ready for a trial? Is that right? Because would you have an obligation to debrief the folks who didn't surface? Or like maybe you were missed. Like, did my doc miss an extra opportunity to get me on a trial, even though, I mean, they still have access to all the usual ways to consider clinical trials. I don't know.
At a minimum, the people who were invited to be on a trial, that might be the opportunity to say how that came about.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I think I think what we wrote, if I recall correctly, is that at least if we were talking about sort of the 50,000 patient denominator, it seemed impossible to try to notify everybody. But yeah, I don't know, should there be a subset? And what's unique to AI about the subset? Like, should we notify everybody that this match miner algorithm is running?
I think it's only because you're doing the actual research on the model. I think eventually if this is used, it would be preparatory to research, a HIPAA category. And it would be, it's like going through the medical records internally within the institution to identify people to approach for a clinical trial. I think it's because right now you're randomizing, you're doing a more of a generalizable knowledge approach. Eventually, it may be operations for preparatory to research.
Yeah, I think so, but I also think that one of the things that, what am I doing? Touch button? Oh, I think so. I can see that perspective, but one of the things that I wrestle here with a little bit is just overall transparency with regard to this. And this isn't specific to your protocol, right? But that we as potentially IRBs and institutions probably need to figure out a better way overall to be transparent about the way that we use, you know, medical record data and all different types of data to do research at our own institutions. And that perhaps some of this is kind of, you know, pointing us towards thinking about language that we can potentially use within our institutions to be a little bit more transparent so that folks know when they come that these are the types of things that could happen there.
One thought, which is not really in contradiction to that, is, you know, there are a few examples of data sets where an institution has de-identified a large swath of its electronic health records data and made them available for machine learning research. And those are really valuable because it's so hard and so rare because of all of these issues. But without them, the field would be a fair bit behind where it is, and we, I think, lose some opportunity to benefit. So yeah, maybe the question is, how do we enable that research in a way that's transparent? Maybe it has to do with sort of the upfront treatment. I mean, the general consents to treatment, though, I don't know, when I go to the doctor, they say, sign this thing in front of you, and they don't show you the paper that you're signing, so.
Yeah.
And we have that, and then the front door consent,
Yeah.
as you were discussing as well, right? So.
I think we're at the timing where we're supposed to open up to the audience. I'm looking to Evan. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Currently, we don't have any questions from the virtual audience, so if anyone in the room has any.
I see one in the back there. I think he's.
Hello, Steve Willis, BDIC community member, pesky community member. A couple questions. One is, from an interesting point of view, what's the email that you're sending to the patients? What does it say?
Emails are not being sent to patients. The
Not being
emails,
potential subjects, sorry.
or potential subjects, they're going to treating oncologists, and in the context of the original pilot, to the oncologists, the research team running the therapeutic clinical trials.
And does it say that, in fact, are there, I guess, type 1 and type 2 errors that would be part of that email?
We have a disclaimer that says this is not perfect. There will be false positives, false negatives, use your clinical judgment here. And then they have the opportunity to, if they want, click a button to indicate whether they agree or not with.
And you're tracking that?
Yes.
Okay. And another question about sort of with the data sources. In collecting the original data, are you using consents that are translated into other languages? That is, are you capturing Spanish only speaking folks so that you can inherently sort of remove biases for language?
The data set is a mixture of data for patients who had genomic sequencing of their tumors done on a clinical basis originally, and is basically analyzed under sort of a secondary use paradigm, and folks who consented to research-based tumor genomic sequencing. In the latter group, there are translated consents available. Is the need to do a translated consent a barrier that may lead to disproportionate enrollment of patients like that on trials like that? I think maybe sort of a separate question, but I mean, it exists.
Yeah, I'll bring you. Okay.
So this has been really great, and oh, Carolyn Chapman from the MRCT Center. First I want to, commend you for being willing to have your project evaluated in this really public and open forum, which is
Yes.
really great. I had a question about waiver of informed consent relative to risk assessment. So when you talked about the randomization, my understanding was that sort of everybody was going to receive sort of standard of care, and then the randomized groups would then have this AI mediated notification system. So I was just wondering, it sounds to me like it would only be an augmentation, so the risk would be minimal. But then I was also wondering if you did find that you had more identified subjects, would you then go back? In other words, would you do like a wedge kind of thing where you go back and apply the same to the other groups to kind of capture that augmented procedure, if you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a study design question. Like, could it have been kind of a stepped wedge design where everybody eventually kind of got their oncologist to get these emails? We talked about that. There were complex discussions around, so if we do that, who do we implement it for? Is it like by disease center? If we do, are we sort of contaminating the waters as we go? Because it's not like we're rolling this out at different institutions. It's sort of different sets of folks who like maybe talking to each other. Is that sort of a clean assessment? I don't know if we, made the right call there.
Sorry, who are you assessing when you just said that?
I don't remember what I said exactly.
You said it might contaminate the waters because.
Oh, the assessment of the, so in other words, if we start rolling out to, an oncologist in the thoracic center, for example, does that kind of have a spillover effect to the oncologist down the hall in the breast center who might be working on the same trial? And we considered these things, decided against that particular approach. And we don't know, frankly, I suspect this study will be negative because there are so many barriers to clinical trial enrollment besides just, do you have progressive disease today? So it's not like we know we have a great thing and want to make sure to give it to everybody.
And you were working mostly with the phase 1 people?
So in the context of the pilot where we're contacting the trial investigators, yes.
Because that's a low enrollment then.
Yes,
Yeah.
which we see.
Yeah, but that's true in all settings. I mean,
Right. Even the emailing the oncologists workflow is mostly phase 1 focus because it's restricted to genomically matched trials. And many trials, most accruals probably are not genomically matched per se.
yeah. I think I saw some other hands.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one thing that you haven't discussed, and I don't see requiring informed consent in this at all. I will say that. And you haven't discussed sort of the bias. So if you had to get informed consent for individuals up front, a group might say, I'm not interested in hearing research at all. And then they're out. But I think what you would really be interested at the end is the fact that they were offered and that they refused. So you may bias your sample by just pulling those people out during the process of getting informed consent, as whether they want to even be approached. So I haven't heard any discussion about that.
Yeah, I think I share that concern mentioned earlier in the context of, well, if you, once you start requiring that, then you may be starting to disproportionately exclude the very people you most want to give a chance to get onto therapeutic trials. So that would be a concern.
So I just have to say, I'm with Susan. I don't see any universe in which the 50,000 should be specifically consented to have their genomic data re-reviewed or pulled in at a time when they may need therapy within a single institution. I mean, I don't even see a HIPAA problem with this.
I don't either.
Frankly. So just want to put it out there. I do think there are a couple of things that have come up. One is the real sort of importance of translating and making sure that we do have comprehension of the participants and patients, because they're patients before they're participants, and that they should know half the reason they're at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute is because it's a research institution. They're going to get the best care possible. So, that's consistent with what they came to expect in going there. Now, you could argue that we do a terrible job of front door consent for research. I agree 100%. We're actually starting to look at that, about what individual hospitals are doing for front door consent, because I think personally, I will be surprised if it's adequate. When I go for my physical therapy, for instance, I get a little electronic window pad to consent to being seen. And I say, well, what am I consenting to? Well, to be seen. I said, but can you show me what I'm signing? Oh, that's online. And I said, I looked last night. It's not online. They said, well, you don't have to sign it, but then you can't be seen. And I'm like, this is who we are right now. So I 100% agree with all sorts of problems in that regard. I also think the other important point you've brought out, I don't even know if there's a question coming up, but we'll see, is that, this question of transparency. I think we should do a job of, as general information, these are the studies we're doing here. I think people, particularly in a cancer hospital, would welcome that. Yeah. And, whether it's true when you test suicidality or not, wholly different situation. But we're not talking about that today, right? I mean, right now. And then the other thing I wanted to say, I think that there are two risks here that we haven't talked about. One is the risk of timing, because, to Carolyn's point, you're taking the window at the moment that you do that screen, where they may or may not have failed their second therapy or whatever. So the fact that the oncologists don't hear from you makes them think that they may, that subject is still at risk a month later when they might be eligible. So having that, making sure that you're re-querying over time, I think is important. I also think the other risk is that you're only working with the phase 1 or early phase trial group. I don't think that this issue of contamination of the other docs is, something to worry about personally, but I do think that making the people you inform, that where you're evaluating whether they bring this up and recruit their patients after that to a further trial, it's problematic to call them in at that point as study investigators. Just to think about.
Yeah, lots of interesting feedback. The calling them study investigators part was specifically around the pilot with the CCTI, the early phase clinical trial group, where we had a defined team up front, and who said, what trials do you have that you're interested in, that we can work on together? So it wasn't like, if we needed to contact you, now you're a collaborator.
It was planned from the beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's different than what we, and I also think the other hugely informative thing you could do is look at why 1,500 people were not eligible or whatever it is. And that is the question that will really move this needle.
Completely agree. The 1,500 that were eliminated by our algorithm, is to some extent by design, because most of them are doing fine without cancer, fortunately. But there is a drop off.
The
Nurse
nursing
navigator, yeah.
piece.
So there's a
500,
500 to like 900 drop. And that I think. I
Other
completely agree.
eligibility
Yeah,
criteria.
It's
Yeah,
other
that's what I
eligibility
meant,
stuff.
that little.
Yeah.
Yeah, and but phase one again is a little bit the cause of that problem. They have more strict eligibility criteria generally.
Yes, although all the.
Yeah. All the trials.
A lot of trials do.
Okay, we have another 10 minutes. Who else disagree? No.
I think there's
wait a
Jackson.
second.
Jackson, do you want to?
Is there anybody on the
Okay.
phone? Oh, you have one.
Jackson.
With what you were saying about, you're fairly sure that it's going to be a negative result for the study because of the other issues that affect clinical trial enrollment. I see what you're saying with that, but I think that this is a really interesting intervention you've developed, and it seems as though it might be a very significant operational intervention were those issues that occur theoretically precedent to the point that you're doing your intervention resolved, right? So if you didn't have those other barriers, what would be going on to enrollment? And so I was wondering, I guess, have you thought at all about working with some of the social behavioral groups who do things like trying to directly address the barriers to care?
So if I understand correctly, you're basically asking how can we get more patients into the denominator in the first place? Like or a more diverse patient population in the initial pipeline?
Yes, and also if participation in trials if I'm less likely to say no, because it's harder for me to get from point A to point B to participate in a trial because I don't have a car, right? And there's a group here that's doing an intervention, giving transportation between, point A to point B for clinical trial participants. Is that something that if that was combined with your intervention would increase enrollment for those trials?
Yeah, I agree. That could be, there's another drop off in that flow sheet I showed from a denominator of like 90 or so patients approached and 10 who had a consult with the phase one group. And I suspect that's where a lot of that stuff comes in. This is a hard problem because the trials, like I said, ask a lot of patients. And that's a kind of a fundamental challenge, some of which might be able to be addressed with things like patient navigation and that sort of thing. I think more broadly, ideally, and this is an area of focus now, figuring out how to match specific patients to specific trials beyond genomic criteria collected through our own internal NGS platform, I think could improve the impact of something like this, roll it out at satellite or network sites where folks have not had the trip to Boston to get the centralized tumor NGS.
Okay. Thank you.
So we'd like you to solve all barriers to clinical trials while you're here. Does anyone else have a question? The panel members had a few more.
What problems did the IRB have when you reviewed it? What was the, sort of response?
I don't think I was here when it was initially reviewed.
Do you know?
I'm not sure I was here either. Sorry, I might have been here for like 4 months.
Plausible deniability.
Yeah, that's 100% what's happening here.
Ken, what was the feedback from the IRB at the time, for which no one here is responsible? Just want you to know.
I probably was responsible, so that's okay. We can remind us.
I do not recall major issues. I think during the SRC review process, there was this question of, is our thing itself a clinical trial? And should it be therefore registered on clinicaltrials.gov and that sort of stuff? That was the only question that I.
That was separate scientific review committee.
Yeah.
And what did you choose to do? Did you register it?
I asked the NIH, which funded the study, what do you think? I asked the program officer. I don't know.
And they said, oh, this isn't a clinical study.
Correct.
Clinical
Yeah.
trial, yeah,
I mean, clinical trials, sorry. Yeah.
because of the health outcomes.
Right.
Right.
Others?
There's
Okay. Oh, thanks. Yeah, go
We got
ahead.
two. So going back to, excuse me, the utilization of AI to reduce barriers in research, which I understand can be its own separate panel discussion. But when we look at data yielded from a project such as this, and we see that flow chart with the initial genomic match to those trials, and then that huge drop off because of the eligibility criteria of those protocols, which have been identified as barriers in and of themselves of being too restrictive to allow for the enrollment of participants. Are we able to leverage any data yielded from this to identify and go back to perhaps industry sponsors of these phase 1 trials with meaningful data that could impact modification of eligibility criteria to allow for broader inclusion for these patients who really need it?
Now that you asked the question, I wish we thought of it 2 years ago. Right, so we were tracking why the nurse navigator didn't contact the treating oncologist, including the patient is not eligible. But we didn't track what about the eligibility criteria makes the patient ineligible to try to hone in on what those real barriers
Submit an
are.
amendment.
Yeah, go back and do a chart review. Yeah.
But to be fair, a couple of years ago, nobody was thinking like this, and now we all are.
Yeah.
Now, Sarah and the DFCI team have gone through the entire protocol to find out which, whether there's intrinsic exclusions in the protocol template that actually could be removed.
And we
You
are
know,
seeing
and-
sponsors come back with, you can enroll HIV positive as long as their viral load is below. They are actually doing,
Yeah.
they're doing
Yeah,
it, following the
ASCO's
FDA.
done a lot of work. We're doing a lot of work to sort of identify those eligibility criteria that really, and just for this group, because it matters, I personally think that eligibility criteria that exclude anyone should be defended and justified explicitly by ethical, scientific, or clinical reasons. And there are many reasons which are fine, but we accept all sorts of, terribly broad exclusion criteria, age 18 to 65. Wait till you're 66. I'm just telling you.
Where cancer is higher rate.
I mean, because frankly, if you're worried about comorbidities, talk about comorbidities or kidney function or whatever. So I think you're exactly on point, but I don't think you should feel bad about it. I think this is an opportunity.
And I think the phase 1 part is also maybe expanding out of that, because those are highly exclusionary and they don't have a lot of data on whether it's dangerous if you have, so they broaden it later.
That's right. And also, if you look at second fail, when they failed their second, there are a lot of programs which already have a third or fourth that they're going to do before a phase 1 trial.
Yeah.
So broadening it would increase your, the complexity, but nevertheless.
Yeah, it's easy for me to say because I don't run phase 1 trials, but the sort of time toxicity and all the stuff that gets asked to patients, I think even beyond eligibility criteria is one of the challenges. I understand why those asks are there from a scientific perspective, but I think it is a barrier.
Good.
My informal survey at a dinner party the other night was everyone thought it would be great if this was done on their data. And one of them actually has cancer, but a group of people said, yes, I would think it'd be fine if they look through my electronic record to invite me to a clinical trial. No one had objections to that. Yeah.
And there are companies that are doing that now, so that, which is great because then you can find patients or find people that are eligible. All right, well, we have 15 minutes. I'll take like a sedative will be great. I really want to thank this group and Ken particularly, such a great conversation to get us forward.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you. And Sarah. For those of you online, we're coming back at exactly 3:00. Thank you.
Hey, how are you?
Right outside, was in the emergency room at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. The good news is both of us were upright. So with that, Susan.
Great. So I'm pleased to introduce Adam Landman, who's the Vice President, Chief Information Officer, Digital Information Officer at MGB. He holds degrees in Information Systems and Healthcare Policy. He is responsible for developing system-wide strategic IT initiatives with the goal of evolving next generation of information systems across the enterprise. In his role, he's also involved in AI projects, and today we've asked him to offer thoughts on AI being developed and utilized in healthcare and in research. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the nice introductions. And Barbara, nice to see you, both of us not in the emergency room today. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about a focus on key data and technology considerations. You know, I want to first start with some background, and I know you've had some background from other speakers today, so I'll go through this quickly, but perhaps with maybe a different lens than others, and then really focus on three issues. One, an information security review as part of considering clinical trials and other work in AI, the data sharing implications, and within data sharing, I'm going to talk about a couple of novel methods technology methods that may help us going forward to preserve data sharing issues. And then I'll talk a little bit about operational impacts of this type of work, and then I hope we'll have a rich discussion. And first I want to start by, I'm a technologist, but just grounding in, why are we all doing this? And it's really about the quintuple aim, right? We want to do this research, we want to do this work because we're trying to improve overall health. We're trying to improve the quality and safety or the experience in which care is delivered, the efficiency in which it's delivered. And then we also want to ensure that all of the work we're doing is available to all patients so that there's equity. And then finally, most importantly, that we're addressing healthcare worker burnout. One of the main issues we've seen on the technology side, as many of you may know, with rollouts of electronic health records, we've actually seen these tools have unintended consequences and increase burden on our providers. And so I'm very sensitive to this. And so when we're talking about new technologies, we really want to make sure they're actually going to improve the provider experience along with these other components of the quintuple aim. I'm, along with you, super excited about AI. I like this drawing because it sort of shows the range of work going on. And honestly, I think all aspects of healthcare have the potential to be impacted by AI. I mean, that's from clinical trials and drug discovery to the back office features and functions in healthcare. So a lot of billing and coding can be automated with AI. Clinical interactions. So you'll hear some examples that I'll talk about with documentation, decision support, and population health based functions can all benefit from AI. So there's a huge amount of opportunity here. I do want to differentiate between two types of AI, analytical and generative AI. Analytical AI has been around for 30 years. You guys have probably been reviewing these types of studies for a long time. And really, this is large data sets are used to reveal novel insights and develop algorithms that can do things like classify, predict, recognize. And so the image you're seeing at the bottom left is that's a colonoscopy image. And it's an example of an AI algorithm that uses a convolutional neural network to identify polyps. So in green, the shading, you're seeing the polyp, and an algorithm identified that. What we're hearing about now, the big rage, is generative AI, and that really has come on the scene over the last year, and it still uses large data sets, but the difference is that the AI is actually generating net new and novel content, and that could be text content. It could also be images. You may have heard of DALL-E. It's fantastic for me. I'm a horrific artist, and I can just type in a description of what I want, and it pops up like 10 different versions of graphics. So it's amazing. It can do coding, and it can also do incredible work with speech and video. So really exciting work on the generative side. And there's a huge market opportunity for generative AI. Some of the analysts are predicting that this will be $1 trillion by 2030, right? And that's just a few years from now. So there's massive interest in this. What's also interesting is that healthcare will be one of the primary areas in which generative AI has an impact, at least according to these predictions. And so not just data and analytics, but workflow tasks like documentation, decision support, also in the simulation areas. So huge potential opportunity here. I think the challenges, and I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the Gartner hype cycle. So Gartner is a technology analyst firm, and basically this is a predicted flow whenever we introduce new technology. And the idea is when you introduce new technology, everybody gets really excited about it. So you go up on this curve of expectations to this like peak of inflated expectations, right? So you get super excited that it's going to cure all our problems. And then you start to realize, well, it doesn't work so well, doesn't actually solve those problems. So you kind of progress down through this trough of disillusionment. And then eventually we kind of figure out where the technology actually has a good fit and actually adds value, and we get to a plateau of productivity. And what you're seeing on this chart is, and it's maybe a little bit small, so I apologize, but basically AI, and particularly generative AI, is really at this peak of inflated expectations, right? You can't pick up a newspaper or go online and not see a story somehow about AI these days. But what I think the opportunity for all of us, for our institutions and our incredibly talented researchers or investigators are, what's going to help us get off of this peak of inflated expectations and ideally get over to the plateau of productivity is research, right? That's frankly what separates us in medicine from lots of other industries that are considering AI. We want to apply evidence-based medicine, our rigorous evaluation, to AI methods. And so when you think about AI models and we talk about algorithms, they all follow a similar life cycle. The first thing is we have to figure out what challenge are we trying to solve. So I'll take an example. We would love to be able to use AI in our very crowded hospitals to figure out which patients can actually be discharged. That would be very, very helpful if we could have an accurate algorithm to help our house staff, our attendings, our nurses figure out which patients are ready to go home. So the first task in figuring that out is you've got to collect the data. And in fact, clean data, spend a lot of time getting the accurate data with all the patient information, with lengths of stays, clinical characteristics, all that data has to be prepared for the model. Then you actually train the model. That's when you're actually using AI techniques, algorithms, statistical analysis, doing the actual model training. And typically in that process, the data set will be divided into a training data set and a validation data set. So you'll train the model, then you'll use the remaining data that you didn't use to train it to do some initial validation of the model. Then you'll actually test that model in the wild and see how it performs. And actually use it in a real world circumstance, and assuming it performs well, then deploy it. And after we deploy these algorithms, we need some mechanism of monitoring them over time. And so that's a life cycle for all kind of AI algorithms. And I think what we're seeing, there are sort of, at least that I'm capturing here, 3 very clear areas where we're going to start, where we are seeing, and you're probably seeing them every day, research opportunities. The first is we have lots of researchers that want to develop and validate AI algorithms. So they may be starting de novo, they have their own data sets, they have data science and statistical expertise, and they build their own algorithms, and they want to publish on and report on that algorithm development. The next stage is they've actually released the algorithm, so they've gotten great data that looks like it works really well, kind of in the setting of developing the model. Then they release it in the wild into the point of care, into clinical settings, and they actually want to study what is the impact. And did it actually achieve the same performance? And so that's the second area where we're starting to see research studies with AI. And the third area, which we really haven't gotten to yet, but I think is very important, is as these AI algorithms get deployed and start being used, we got to monitor them over time. And we may see research studies that look over time at the performance of these algorithms and then identify algorithms that need to be adjusted or even removed if they're not performing well. So that's a just general area of, I think, the types of research studies we will start to see. I also want to make a distinction of build versus buy. in many of our organizations, we have incredibly talented folks that are going to want to build their own algorithms. So they're going to have huge data sets, massive computational power, and they're going to build. There are others that are going to be looking at other companies. These could be large companies, startups that are building their own, that are building the algorithms, and they're looking to our investigators and our institutions to validate and study those algorithms. So we wouldn't actually be developing the AI, we'd be doing the research to evaluate it. So I just want to make that distinction as we go forward. So data is the currency of AI. And it underlies all of the studies and everything we're going to see. So now I want to sort of zoom in on the 3 areas of focus, certainly that I spend a lot of time thinking about from a technology side. The thing that keeps me up at night is cyber, right? Especially if we're talking about large data sets. You know, we don't want these data being compromised and potentially exfiltrated from our organizations and shared inappropriately. And we also don't want our data corrupted, right? We don't want to have ransomware that comes and locks the data so that researchers can't use it. Unfortunately, we do see these incidents. And so the question is, how do we protect ourselves the best we can from this? And I would just say, I don't think we can perfectly protect ourselves. This is the reality of the world we live in. There are very smart people thinking about how they can get to us every day, and we're trying our best to defend ourselves. One of the first things we can do is whenever we're dealing with technology and large data, do an information security review. This is sort of the equivalent of the IRB on the technology side and the data side. And what we're trying to do is really understand first, what is the researcher trying to do? What's their use case? And then understand how they're using data and technology. And what we really want to understand is exactly the data flows and the data storage. And that's why I just highlighted this technical architecture diagram, which is a simple one. This often tells us a lot of what we're looking for. It tells us who's accessing the system, where do the data flows, like you're seeing on the right-hand side where the data is stored in a database or a file system. And we want to know things like, is that in the cloud? Is it in a data center for the institution? What controls are around that? So those diagrams become very, very important for our security and technology teams to be able to review and really understand the system and the data flows. We also want to understand who's actually accessing the system. Is it just the research team? Do they have a subcontractor, maybe a technology subcontractor helping them manage the system? So that's very important for us to know. And then it's about the controls. It's about things like access, who has access to the system? How are they maintaining that? Where are these servers actually located? Is there physical security? So it's a bunch of questions about that. And then we also like to think about worst case scenario and disaster planning. So what type of resiliency does this system have? Does it have backup? Is the backup on site? Is it somewhere else? So helping to make sure that there's some resiliency built in case there's a problem. And in our organization, we've worked closely with Martha and Benji and others such that the IRB and the technology reviews are tightly coupled so that if there's a study that comes through that has a technology component or an AI component, it triggers automatically a security review, which leads to a questionnaire that asks about all of these areas. And then our technical teams get engaged to actually review it. And what comes out of that review is an audit finding. And this is just a sample, but one example is if you're using a third-party system, oftentimes you have to log into that system. So one of the classic findings we have is those systems often want you as a researcher or your organization as researchers to set up and maintain logins for all of those systems. That's not a great practice. We would prefer that it do single sign-on with your institutional sign-ons. And if we can use the institutional sign-ons, the reason that's a good thing is that if you leave the organization and we deactivate your institutional login, well, you no longer have access to the study resource as well. So that's an example of a finding. And so the security review provides these findings, and then the researcher needs to work with the technology teams and the IRBs to make sure we've satisfactorily addressed all of these risks. We won't be able to perfectly address them, but at least we know about them. We can resolve as many as possible and really think about how big of a risk are the open ones. I want to talk a little bit about data sharing. This is a complex topic. I'm just going to hit the highlights, but I'll share a story of maybe 10 years ago now. A researcher approached me and said, I'm doing a study, I want to create some algorithms that will help interpret ECGs. And they basically asked for all of our ECGs from our organization. And I said, oh, no problem. We can get that for you. And started to think through the technology to be able to grab the ECG database and get it to the researcher. Well, obviously I was much naiver 10 years ago. I've learned a little bit. And clearly there are a lot of other questions that we need to ask and answer before just providing the data, because technically we can do all of this stuff. There's ways to do that. But we need to really think, well, do those ECGs have patient identifying information on them? Do they identify the organization or the clinicians that may have reviewed them? And do we need, you guys ask all this stuff every day. Do you need consent before you actually share that? Who owns those ECGs? What can be done with those ECGs? Is it only for the study or can it be used for other purposes? So there's a bunch of real considerations that need to be considered before sharing this. My colleagues at MGB, really led by Kim Derniak and Megan Fenno, led our tissue and data sharing committee. So when this started, maybe not 10 years ago, but 9 or 8 years ago, we were trying to learn how to handle this. And so the way we did this is we assembled a governance group and we started bringing data sharing requests to the governance group to review and make decisions on. And as they did that, they started to put together kind of a case law that has now evolved into principles and guidance that now enables us to make quicker decisions when there are requests. And we essentially now use the Tissue and Data Sharing Governance Committee for exceptions. So if it falls outside of what we've usually seen or our usual principles, then we bring the request for data to the committee to help adjudicate. And some of the high-level principles are, we want to be a good steward of our patient data and tissue samples, but we also want to help use them for the charitable missions of our organization, which of course includes research and discovery. And so this is a very high level summary. This could probably be an hour talk or more just on this topic, but I did want to share first, the first one's obvious, but maybe I needed help on this, that all aspects of data and tissue sharing engagements are important, right? Every single component of exactly what data, what's the inclusion, who are they going to be shared with, the details matter. The second is, we really want to ensure that we are sharing data and it fits within our charitable mission, right? So this is where we'd look really hard at groups that are requesting data and want to just pay us for the data and they just want the data. That would be something we'd have to look at very, very carefully and it would have to go through an exception request. But we absolutely want to facilitate research and be able to share data for research purposes. We also want to look at secondary use, and by secondary use, I mean, they're asking for data for a particular study. That means that the data would only be available for the primary use of that study. Any secondary use, such as another unrelated study, or maybe they want to commercialize some of the data, that would not be acceptable and again, would generate an exception. And then the last point I sort of hit earlier, that data access and security is critical. We still need to go through the information security review and really understand where is the information going and how do we ensure we protect it. What I want to spend a little bit of time on, and I hope will be maybe a little bit novel, is some emerging technologies and methodologies that will help facilitate information security and data sharing. So abiding by all the principles and thinking about how not to get hacked, there's some emerging technologies here that may really help facilitate and accelerate research. And there's three. It's a secure data enclave, de-identification tools, and then federated data sharing. And the first is a data enclave. And the idea here is that, and this can be in a data center or it could be in a cloud. The idea is that there is a defined system that all of the data resides on. So you can put data into the system, you can do analysis on the data, generate insights from it, but the data stays in this platform. You cannot get the data out. And the benefit of the data cloud, the data enclave, is that you can have lots of people collaborate. So you can bring in collaborators from industry, from inside your organization. You can control who has access. It can be remotely accessed, so people can be accessing from home or different work locations. And all of that data can then be accessible for joins, for analysis. Oftentimes the standard analytics tools are added, R, Python, all of those packages are preloaded onto the compute. So this data enclave has both storage capability and compute. And investigators can upload their own data sets and join them. But the real value is none of that data is leaving that environment. And so that is one mechanism that we're certainly starting to use. For instance, we created a COVID-19 data enclave, which allowed researchers both in our organization and from around the country to collaborate on very rich COVID data, and really accelerated that work. The second method is de-identification, and a lot of this is being pioneered by John Halamka and the Mayo Clinic platform. There are a bunch of groups doing this, but the Mayo Clinic is pretty far advanced on this. And the idea is, our data right now, our notes have identifiers in them. They may have patient names, doctor names, dates, and now there are algorithms that can read through a note and identify patient identifying or other sensitive information. You're seeing that in kind of the middle, highlighted in pink, where it's detecting patient information. And there's sort of a couple ways these algorithms can then work. They could actually remove that data, or what you're seeing here is it can transform that data. So it removes the sensitivity by changing the name, adjusting the date or the time. And so that's what you're seeing here. These methods are getting increasingly sophisticated, and some organizations are to the point where they've applied these de-identification algorithms. Then they bring in a third-party auditor, and the third-party auditor reviews takes a sample of the data and actually signs off on how well de-identified the environment is. And so the numbers at Mayo, I think they're either 98 or 99% that the data has been de-identified. And so once the data is de-identified, as all of you know, it changes the sort of sensitivity of the data, and it permits us to share that data more readily. And so this is a really exciting option to protect our information, but to broaden data sharing options. The next idea is called federated data sharing. And by the way, all of these techniques can also be combined together, so they're not mutually exclusive. But the idea behind federated data sharing at a high level is that the data stays at the institution that originated the data. And so what you're seeing in this picture is you've got a researcher that wants to run an algorithm, an analysis on data that's distributed across, in this picture, 4 different sites or 4 different countries. And so the researcher submits the request into this federated data network. The request then goes to the individual site. That request is processed locally at the site. The algorithms run, the analysis is run, and then just the aggregate results of that analysis get sent out and then get sent to a specific aggregator tool that pools the data together and sends the result to the researcher. So the researcher never sees the data at any of the other sites, and they only see the aggregate results. And so this is an exciting technology. It is, on the newer side, but you may start to see this as well. And you can also start to see these combined. So you might actually have de-identified data, and the analysis is done in a federated way, which provides even more protection because you're de-identified and then the data is not leaving and it's staying local. So I think these are really exciting tools. I will say they're new. They may not work for every use case, but I think these start to enable us to facilitate collaboration while still respecting data ownership, privacy. So hopefully you guys, maybe we can get to a discussion. I'll be curious if you guys are starting to see protocols that use some of these tools and techniques. I want to talk a little bit about operational impact. And this is near and dear to my heart because most of my day job is kind of keeping our systems running and trying to meet the operational needs of the organization and trying to balance that with we want to totally accelerate and support our researchers, but sometimes the interests of our researchers and our organization do not totally overlap. And so how do we start to think about that? The first one is AI projects require IT support. They just do. And so whether it's from the information security review process, which can be quite time consuming, to data access, right? Researchers need data, and where are they going to get that data? And do they need an IT expert to be able to facilitate that data? Oftentimes, these tools may require EHR integration. I'll talk a little bit about and show an example of that in a second. And sometimes they want to run in the cloud, and we may need to use IT experts to help configure the cloud correctly, get them access, set up billing, all of those things. So there is an investment required to be able to support this work. And this is, I think, where sometimes we have challenges, which is we want our researchers to absolutely go dream up the most innovative and novel projects they can, but sometimes they compete with our operational priorities. And so one example that we're starting to see is researchers embracing the cloud, embracing this concept of bringing lots of data sets together into a data mart or a data lake and putting it in the cloud. But often they want to do their own version of that, right? So we see the Department of Anesthesiology wants to set up a data lake, and then emergency medicine wants to set up a data lake. Well, we're also trying to set one up at the organizational level for everybody. And so how can we try to balance everyone's interests and use our resources efficiently so that we can benefit the most people? And so over time, we hope to build out enterprise capabilities in the system that will be able to support all of these use cases and frankly accelerate it. Because if we put all of the data centrally, there's actually really novel techniques now where if all of the data is in the cloud, you don't even need to make a copy of it. You can just point to the data set you want, and we can create a subset of the data for anesthesia and emergency medicine right in the enterprise cloud, and they don't have to do their own thing. So part of what we need to do, certainly on my teams, is engage with the departments, share where we're going from an institution, understand their needs, and hopefully try to partner together. Another example is, and this goes more in the case of when investigators are evaluating products, not building their own. And the idea here is there's a slew of really exciting AI tools coming on the market. One of them is ambient documentation. I'll share this example, which is probably one of the largest pain points for our clinicians is documentation, right? You have to document after every patient you see. We have tried lots of tools. We've tried lots of tools to help alleviate this, things like speech recognition. We've even have scribes where there's college-educated individuals that will follow along our providers and basically take notes and write their notes. Scribes work really well, but they are expensive, and scribes also like to go on to medical school and other things, and so there's a high turnover rate. Sorry, So there now AI has gotten to a level that with the new generative AI tools that have come out, that AI can actually automatically create a clinician note. The idea is that you have the app or the product on your phone. You go and see your patient, you hit record, it records, you just do your normal conversation with the patient, records it, then sends that to the cloud, to the vendor's cloud, where it does speech recognition, natural language processing, natural language understanding, and then uses large language models to summarize the conversation, and it spits out a note. And so you can imagine we're interested in this on the operational side. Many of our researchers are also interested in this. And what I'm finding is that the researchers are talking to the companies and creating deals to do research engagements. And I'm simultaneously trying to sign operational agreements. And the problem here is that it takes a lot of work to get the contracts in place to integrate these products. And it's difficult if we're doing it for the operational product and 2 research projects and then have 3 of these products. And so a lot of what I these days try to spend my time doing is trying to build goodwill and have our researchers work with us on the operational side and let's evaluate some of the tools we're using on the operations side. But this is very challenging because all of this work is resource intense. And so really working hard to align these priorities. Here's a final example. And I'm sorry, it's a little small on the screen, but this is how a lot of the AI algorithms will end up, right? So someone's building even that length of stay algorithm that I sort of alluded to at the very beginning or described at the very beginning. What you're seeing here is a screenshot. This happens to be a Cerner system. This is a typical clinical EHR screenshot where it's listing all of the patients on a unit. What you're seeing on the far right is a column. This says deterioration alert, but you could also call it length of stay alert. And the idea is that here is that you're seeing a red mark or a yellow mark if the algorithm is reaching a certain threshold. So the idea here is that we've integrated the algorithm into the workflow of the clinicians. So the clinicians can get alerted and then they just click on that red or yellow icon and it takes them to more information to learn about the alert. So this is where we ultimately want to go as our researchers are building or evaluating. They're ultimately going to want to evaluate at the point of care the impact of these algorithms on clinical decisions and patient outcomes. And so this also requires IT support. But what I look at is we really want to be partnered because we're fortunate to have incredible researchers, incredible IT talent. We've got to find a way to build the bridge so that the incredible discoveries and the validations that our researchers are making actually make it to the point of care. And I think there's a real opportunity there to make sure that we don't lose that opportunity, that when our researchers publish in the New England Journal this incredible finding, we also take the time to translate it so it can reach all of the clinicians and patients in our organization. I'm really excited for that opportunity, but it takes a commitment to do that and process to do that. So I guess I just want to thank everybody. We covered, I think, a bunch, but the key points here are if we really want to advance health AI, we need research, we need IRB and regulatory review and guidance, and we're still learning how to do this. So this session is incredibly valuable as we work through ensuring that these algorithms are safe and that they're equitable and they have value. And ultimately, this work is going to help inform whether they get approved by the FDA. So thank you all.
Questions?
Thanks for that really interesting overview. On the data sharing theme, everybody is interested in whether AI models or approaches generalize. There's at least a theoretical risk that when you train an AI model on data, it can memorize the data. Even if you do federated learning, there's some risk of data leakage. How should researchers and regulatory folks think about that risk when evaluating AI proposals that might involve ideally sharing a model for other folks to use at other sites?
It's an excellent question. I think we're all trying to figure out how big a risk that is and then how much, how to address it. We could start, there's a conservative answer here, which is to assume that these AI models, if they've been trained or exposed on clinical data, that they in fact are clinical and they, treat them like PHI. And I think that may be where we're sort of starting. My hope is that over time we can get more sophisticated to really tease out and answer that question of, do they really have clinical data in them? And hopefully be able to, at least for some subset of those algorithms, not treat them that way. But I think we're working on figuring that. We need to figure that out. I know the FDA has that on their list.
Others? Can I ask one, and it's about bias. So it seems to me that when you talk about taking your data set and splitting it, training and validating, you're essentially using the same potentially biased data set. And you're concretizing because you're agreeing with yourself, number one. The second thing about the data identification, so that's one issue of bias. The second about the de-identification technique is in modifying some of those pieces, like the address, you're changing the socioeconomic data available for analysis. So I know that, you put down Brooklyn, New York as the one, and it does not start with 30102, like that's the wrong zip code. So that's pretty obvious, but it's also different than where that person came from. So how do you think about sort of the responsibility in that regard?
Great questions. On the bias one, I think this is why, well, I know this is why we're looking to form networks. That's why the data sharing piece is so important, because we recognize that we need to get to data sets that actually represent, that are not biased to one setting, but that actually encompass large populations of the United States or even the world. And so that's why you're seeing groups like Mayo Clinic Platform trying to get other organizations to participate and join their platform, so that when they do evaluate an algorithm, it's not just based on the Mayo data, it's based on now a set from across the country or the world. I will say, it's not a small task to do that, because you've got to agree on the data format. We still have a data format challenge in this country where, health data is not standardized. And so that is a very significant investment that needs to be made to standardize the data, clean the data in order for that to happen. So I do think getting to and by the way, that size is not infinite. So we don't need every health system in the country participating, but you need to get to a certain size so that you're getting for that. So getting to your second question about de-identification, you are absolutely right. I think we have to look at what the use case is, what the algorithm is, and if the algorithm really needs geographic variables in it, then de-identification is not the right technique to use. And in fact, you may need to go to keep identified data, use federated analysis so that the data is not actually shared. But I think that's why these techniques there's not a panacea. We're probably going to need a combination of these techniques, and it's going to depend on the use case. And by the way, there may also be use cases where we actually just have to share the data and may even need to store the data. I think that's still going to be important. And so I think we have to have informed decisions in the study design part of that to figure out how to support the study best.
Hi, Jackson Norton, DFCI. Sorry, that's not supposed to be so loud. My question has to do with the use of AI tools that are being deployed in the wild as part of research studies where they're not being evaluated. How do we as IRB reviewers make sure that there's sufficient peer-reviewed evidence about the validity of an AI tool being used in research? Is that something that we should look to an information security or an IT review for? Is that something that we're going to want to look for, scientific expertise within our boards themselves?
It's a really good question. I would hope the researcher would have, I would think they'd have the responsibility to make sure the algorithm they're using has been validated for the purpose they want to use it for. It may not be happening, but I would think that they'd be the expert to help make that decision. Where the technology folks would want to come into play is understanding how that algorithm works. Are we sharing data with it? Is there a risk with it? But I don't think the technology teams will be able to answer it. We'll be able to answer that question. I do hope over time, and certainly there are sort of people that have ideas of health AI assurance labs. Eventually there may become lists of algorithms, and whether or not they've been certainly FDA approved or reviewed by other bodies. So that may help. But I definitely think maybe the IRB should be pointing out to the investigators, hey, you're using an algorithm here, is this appropriate for your research? And then the technology teams can help on the technical assessment. But others may also have comments on that and may be better poised to answer it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't think you can do this in all cases, but we've had several examples where people have developed algorithms and then they put them out there for people to use. But they also tell them, to see what it says, make their own clinical decision, explain why they may not follow it. And so there are processes. You can't do that in all, but there are processes that you just don't develop something and put it out there and use. But there is some mechanism to get feedback and how predictive it is, see what the algorithm says, see what they did, then look at the outcome to see those types of things. So there's many protocols that are like that.
I mean, certainly on the clinical side, we're setting up governance that before we implement an algorithm, we are going to look at those exactly as you described, the performance, the characteristics, and make a decision of whether it should be implemented. So definitely on the clinical side, the question though, maybe as I'm thinking through this, the IRB may need to say, can you show me those? The researcher should be doing that diligence, but then you may be asking for evidence that that diligence was done, and was it a reasonable decision based on the performance of the algorithm?
But it does seem to me that one of the things we should be doing is linking the research sort of process better with the clinical processes within each system. So, because I don't think that happens all the time. It's one thing if you're applying a research question to a clinical algorithm in the clinical database, but a lot of research goes on with algorithms on a research database that's invisible to the organization, essentially. I mean, it's obviously visible, but it's not in the normal course of work.
Absolutely, and
So how would you like that to be seen?
Well, first, so thank you for inviting me even to present in this audience, because I think at MGB, we have a wonderful collaboration between our research leadership, our IRB leadership, and our IT and digital leadership. I think it starts there in each organization, and there needs to be collaboration and maybe and joint review of some. So I think that's the core of it, as as all these groups are learning how to handle this.
So one thing that I would say, we're representatives of whatever 17 organizations plus the world because of the virtual participants. It would be helpful to have a list of sort of core questions that should be provided by the investigator to the IRB at the time of IRB review to make sure that they even know what, questions they should be answering for the IRB and it also prevents this sort of ping pong and frustration on both sides.
I agree. And I think we have that for sort of the technologies that we have seen. And I think we need to continue to edit and update that as we go forward with AI algorithms and including some of the great questions that were asked here.
And it seems to me further that it's the same sort of system with your data and tissue, whatever the committee was, that eventually we'll get to a point where we know and we're comfortable and then would send you, as it were, the exceptions. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think maybe that's I think we're all learning here, and we may need to take a little bit of risk here and learn how this works and then adapt our processes as we go forward.
And this is probably obvious, but what happens at research leadership does not always trickle down, or the research clinical and technical. So understanding how to access that is worthwhile.
No, that's a really good point. And I'll also say this is where cybersecurity has been helpful, because I do think at least our research community, they are very vigilant. They are concerned about cybersecurity, and they're willing to work with us to ensure that they're protecting their research data. And I think we can use that as we go forward as reasons we need to engage. And also, if we want to scale this at the end, we need to follow these best practices. So hopefully we start with the carrot of why we need to do this and work together.
And I just want to say to the people online that this is much easier to think about in a larger organization, that many of our organizations are pretty small and have, relatively few people dedicated even on the clinical side. And then to ask them to do this additional burden is difficult. But it is something that's why we try to provide those kinds of resources in terms of like, here are the essential questions you should think about. So sort of when to get help.
There might also be a business opportunity here. Could you spin up a technology supplemental review that people could contract with? And I mean, there is a company that does commercial
and
information
take that
security
through our
reviews.
conflict of interest committee.
Sorry,
I just can't wait for that. But
I
go
have
ahead.
no conflicts with this, but I do think there's to your point, it is a lot of work. It's an investment, and could there be an opportunity to help make that service available across sites?
So I have one other no, I don't have another question. Okay, I have one more question, which is, a lot of the research questions that, for instance, we're doing are things like, how do participants / patients want to be asked about their sexual orientation and gender identity? I know that you guys we chose it and put it in, And already we're getting sort of feedback about that. So in a research setting like that, where we'd love to really work with the organization, how does that get done?
So that's this last piece about translation that we don't do well enough. And so what I would say is the way I've seen it done best is if the researchers reach out to the operational leaders and even share ahead of time that they're doing the study. Often we could even participate on the studies and help. And then when the study results come in, have a dialogue at the end and see which we could implement. So for instance, I'd be very interested in those findings. And those are things we can modify in the electronic health record of what are we naming things. So that translation piece, but often starts with relationships. And so I think the more that the researchers can partner with their operational colleagues, the better. And I think that it's going to help accelerate both sides. And I'll just add one other thing. On the operation side, we're looking to partner with researchers. Like we're doing things on the operation side that we know are novel, and I'd really like to evaluate. When I evaluate it, I get a crummy study out of it. I'd much rather, sorry, and you've seen my IRB applications, but I want to work with folks who really do this and are really trained every day to do it. And I think that could be a rich partnership as well. Like come help evaluate this new ambient documentation solution that we're working on. And, it's a great partnership.
Thank you. So much more to say, but we really want to thank you for being here and for providing the perspective. And thank you, Adam. Okay. All yours.
Okay, so I know we've been sitting a long time, so feel free to get up, stand up, whatever, as we're moving into the last part of the sessions today. But these are some very exciting talks and a panel we have coming up. So I hope you'll stick with us here. We're moving into some kind of real operational discussions and work here. And I have the great pleasure of introducing the next two speakers. The first one is Dr. Benji Silverman, who is going to be talking with us about reviewing a study using AI. Benji is the senior IRB chair at Mass General Brigham and the chair of the Mass General Brigham Embryonic Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee. He also serves as the director of ethics for the Institute for Technology and Psychiatry at McLean Hospital and is an instructor in psychiatry and faculty member at the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School. So Benji will be speaking first, and he will be followed by Megan Kazmatis Singleton, who's going to be talking to us about how can AI assist the IRB. I'm excited about this one, Megan. You'll help us figure out how to do our work better. Megan is the Associate Dean for Human Research Protections and the Director of the Human Research Protection Program at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. In this role, she is responsible for oversight and direction of their 8 institutional review boards, and I believe their Human Research Protection Program there. And Benji and Megan actually have one connection as well, that I think Benji went to medical school at Johns Hopkins, so we'll have a connection there. So I'm going to turn things over to Benji, and feel free to check online for more information about their background and biographies.
Thanks so much, Martha, for the wonderful introduction. Thanks so much, Dr. Bierer and the planning committee for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk with you all about IRB review of research involving AI. As I was preparing for this and thinking about both creating the slides and preparing my remarks, 2 things really dawned on me that I want to share for context. The first is that 20 minutes is certainly not enough to really get into the details of how to review a study involving AI. As all of us who do IRB work know, the devil is always in the details. We're not going to have time to get into all those details, and I'm going to breeze through a lot of information pretty quickly, so I apologize in advance for that. And the second is that I'm probably actually going to raise more questions than I am going to provide answers, which is unfortunate because maybe you were hoping I was going to provide answers. But my hope is to at least just kind of give a general framework for how I think about these things, how we think about these things, and just help us continue to have a conversation together as we grapple with this type of work moving forward. So I'm not going to spend really any time on this because you heard all about it today already. There's an awesome potential for AI to help with health and digital health, particularly doing things that people can't do on their own and providing more care in the right place at the right time to more people. But there's also an incredibly scary problem with health and digital health powered by AI. It doesn't always work, meaning it gives the wrong answer at times, and it doesn't always